Some people disappear, others simply stop existing. The Judith Basin spreads across central Montana like a shallow bowl pressed into the earth by some ancient, indifferent hand. Rimmed by the Little Belt Mountains to the south and the Highwood Range to the north, it stretches nearly 50 miles in places, a sea of grass that by the early 1900s had become one of the most fertile wheat-growing regions in the American West. The Northern Pacific Railway called it the breadbasket of the future. Land speculators called it opportunity. The families who actually worked it called it something else, though most of those words have been lost to time. By 1910, the basin was dotted with homesteads, small wooden structures built by Norwegian immigrants, German-Russian settlers, and families from the depleted farmlands of Minnesota and the Dakotas. They came for the promise of 160 acres under the Enlarged Homestead Act, and they stayed because leaving meant admitting defeat. The land was generous in summer and merciless in winter. The nearest proper town, Lewistown, sat 30 miles east, reachable only by wagon roads that turned to mud each spring and froze solid each November. It was not a place where people vanished without explanation. The community was too small, the distances too vast, the need for mutual aid too pressing. Everyone knew their neighbors, not well perhaps, but well enough. When someone left, word traveled. When someone died, there were burials. The Judith Basin, for all its isolation, kept records. Which is what makes the night of October 17, 1912, so difficult to explain. The Lindqvist family lived 4 miles north of the Warm Spring Creek crossing in a 2-room cabin they had built the previous summer. Eric Lindqvist, 34, had emigrated from Uppsala with his wife Margreta and their 3 children, twin boys aged 8 and a daughter aged 11. Their homestead claim had been officially filed in March of 1911. By all accounts, they were making progress. The winter wheat had taken hold. A root cellar had been dug. Eric had recently traded labor with a neighbor to acquire 2 dairy cows. 7 miles southeast, the Novak family worked a parcel near Cottonwood Creek. Joseph Novak, a widower from Bohemia, lived with his elderly mother and his 4 children, the youngest just 6 years old. He was known in Lewistown as a quiet man who paid his debts on time and spoke English with careful precision. And 11 miles west, near the base of a low, unnamed ridge, the Harwell family, Wallace, his wife Ruth, and their 2 teenage sons, had established what neighbors considered the most promising claim in the area. Wallace Harwell had worked as a surveyor before turning to farming, and his knowledge of drainage and soil composition had given him an advantage. The Harwells were the only American-born family among the Taos, 3 having relocated from a failed farm in Nebraska. None of the 3 families knew each other beyond passing acquaintance. They did not share church services, work crews, or supply runs. Their homesteads formed an uneven triangle across the basin, connected by nothing except the landscape itself. On the morning of October 18, 1912, all 3 homesteads were found abandoned. The discovery was made by a mail carrier named Thomas Riley, who noticed the Lindqvist cabin's door standing open as he passed on his route. When he approached to investigate, he found the breakfast table still set, bowls of oatmeal congealed and cold, a pot of coffee sitting on a stove that had burned down to ash. The family's clothing remained in the single wardrobe. Their wagons sat in the barn. The 2 dairy cows stood in their pen, unmilked and distressed. Riley rode to the Novak homestead to raise help. He found the same scene: food left uneaten, livestock untended, personal belongings exactly where they should be. On the kitchen table, a letter addressed to Joseph Novak's brother in Chicago sat unfinished, the ink still damp enough to smear when Riley touched it. The letter's final visible sentence read, "The children have been asking about the sound, and I do not know what to." It stopped there. The pen lay on the floor, as if dropped. By the time a search party reached the Harwell property that afternoon, no one was surprised to find it empty, but they were disturbed by what Ruth Harwell had left behind: a detailed household ledger maintained with the precision her surveyor husband had instilled, in which the final entry, dated October 17th, read simply, "The ridge is singing again. Wallace says we must go." 23 people vanished that night. No bodies were ever recovered. Horrifying. Alma Dietrich, who in 1912 lived 6 miles from the Lindqvist homestead, was interviewed by a Lewistown newspaper reporter 3 days after the disappearances. She was 91 when a graduate student from the University of Montana recorded her testimony again in 1978. Her account remained consistent across 66 years. "I heard it too," she said in the recording, her voice thin but certain. "The singing. It wasn't music exactly, more like wind, but with intention, like the land was humming to itself. My husband heard it too. He told me to stay inside and lock the door, and I did, and in the morning I watched from the window as the Lindqvist's smoke stopped rising. They always had smoke from that stove, even in warm weather. Margareta liked her coffee hot. But that morning, nothing." When asked why she and her husband hadn't disappeared, Dietrich paused for several seconds before answering. "We couldn't see the ridge from our place. The Lindqvists could. The Novaks could. The Harwells were right up against it." Marcus Teller, a ranch hand who worked seasonal jobs throughout the basin, told investigators in 1912 that he had camped within a mile of the ridge 2 weeks before the disappearances. His statement, preserved in Fergus County records, describes waking at approximately 2 in the morning to what he called a sound like a choir warming up, but wrong, like the notes were going in instead of out. He packed his bedroll and left before dawn. When he learned of the disappearances, he reportedly refused to return to the basin for the rest of his life. A geological survey conducted in 1923 found nothing unusual about the ridge in question. It rises only 120 feet above the basin floor, composed of unremarkable sandstone and shale. No caves, no unusual mineral deposits, no acoustic anomalies that could explain the singing multiple witnesses described. The surveyor's report, however, contains a handwritten addendum that was not included in the official findings. Instruments behaved erratically within 300 yards of the ridge's northwest face. Compass readings inconsistent. Team declined to camp at the site. Chibame. The Fergus County Sheriff's Office conducted an investigation that lasted officially 4 months. Unofficially, it ended after 3 weeks, when the assigned deputy, a man named Howard Crane, submitted his resignation without explanation and moved to California. Crane's case file, which remained sealed until 1989, contains details that never appeared in newspaper accounts. Among them, a notation that all 3 homesteads contained clocks that had stopped at the same time, 3:17 in the morning. Another notation describes footprints found outside the Harwell cabin, leading toward the ridge, that terminated abruptly after approximately 400 yards, as if the family had simply ceased to exist mid-stride. Most disturbing is a single photograph, attached to the file without caption or explanation. It shows the interior of the Lindqvist cabin, specifically the east-facing window. On the glass, visible only because of the angle of morning light, someone had written 2 words in what appears to be breath condensation. It called. The Montana Historical Society has no record of any search for the families extending beyond 1913. No death certificates were ever issued. The homestead claims were quietly reverted to federal ownership in 1915, and the land was never reclaimed. Census records from 1920 show the basin's population had declined by nearly 40%. Many of the families who left cited economic hardship. A few, in letters preserved by descendants, mentioned other reasons. A sound they couldn't explain, a ridge they couldn't stop watching, a feeling that they were being observed by something patient. The ridge still stands, of course. Satellite imagery shows it clearly, an unremarkable geological feature in an unremarkable landscape. Hikers occasionally pass through the area, though few camp there. Online forums dedicated to Montana's backcountry contained scattered references to the site, most of them vague complaints about equipment malfunctions or poor sleep. In 2016, a retired school teacher from Billings visited the basin to research the disappearances for a local history project. She spent 3 days interviewing descendants of families who had lived in the area. On her 4th day, she drove out to photograph the ridge. Her camera, when she returned to Billings, contained 43 images. 42 showed landscape shots of the basin. The 43rd, time-stamped during her visit to the ridge, showed only white, a perfect, even white, as if the camera had photographed nothing at all. She deleted the image and never returned. The wheat still grows in the Judith Basin. The ridge still rises above it, low and patient. And on certain October nights, when the wind drops and the air turns cold, locals say you can still hear something that might be singing, if you're close enough and if you're foolish enough to listen. No one knows what called the homesteaders into the wheat. But something did, and there's no evidence it ever stopped. There are places where the numbers simply refuse to make sense. Flathead Lake sits in the northwest corner of Montana, cradled between the Mission Mountains to the east and the Salish Range to the west. It is the largest natural freshwater lake west of the Mississippi, stretching nearly 28 miles long and 15 miles wide at its broadest point. The water is famously clear. Visibility can exceed 30 feet on calm days, and the surface reflects the sky with such precision that pilots have reported momentary disorientation, unable to distinguish where the air ends and the lake begins. The Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes have lived along its shores for thousands of years. Their oral histories speak of the lake with respect, but also caution. In the Salish language, certain stories about the water are told only in winter, when the lake is at its quietest. Elders have declined to share some of these stories with researchers, citing reasons that don't translate cleanly into English. The closest approximation, according to one ethnographer who worked in the region during the 1980s, is something like, "The lake listens, and some things should not be spoken where it can hear." European settlers arrived in the late 1800s, drawn by timber, mining, and the agricultural potential of the Flathead Valley. They mapped the lake, measured its depths, and declared it understood. Official surveys conducted between 1915 and 1977 consistently recorded a maximum depth of approximately 370 feet, located in a depression near the southern end of the lake, known as Skidoo Bay. For decades, that number went unchallenged. The lake was deep, but not unusually so. It was cold at the bottom, but not dangerously. It was, by all accounts, thoroughly ordinary. Then came the summer of 1993. The University of Montana's Limnology Department had been conducting routine surveys of Flathead Lake since the early 1980s, tracking water quality, temperature gradients, and sediment distribution. In June of 1993, a research team led by Dr. Francis Okonkwo deployed new side-scan sonar equipment capable of producing higher resolution depth readings than previous instruments. The team consisted of Dr. Okonkwo, 2 postdoctoral researchers, and a graduate student named Elias Marchetti, who was responsible for monitoring and logging the sonar data in real time. The survey was expected to take 3 weeks, covering the lake in a systematic grid pattern. For the first 12 days, the data matched existing records almost exactly. Depth readings varied by inches, not feet. The equipment performed flawlessly. Marchetti later described the work as tedious but satisfying, the kind of science that confirms rather than discovers. On June 19th, the research vessel entered the southern basin near Skidoo Bay. Approximately 2:15 in the afternoon, the sonar registered an anomaly. The depth reading, which had been hovering around 340 feet, suddenly dropped. The instrument showed 400 feet, then 500. Then, for approximately 90 seconds, it held steady at 917 feet, more than twice the lake's official maximum depth. Marchetti called Dr. Okonkwo to the monitoring station. She watched as the vessel completed its pass, turned, and made a second run over the same coordinates. The reading appeared again, 917 feet, holding for roughly the same duration before returning to expected depths. A third pass produced identical results. A fourth pass, conducted 20 minutes later, showed nothing unusual. The anomaly was gone. Dr. Okonkwo ordered the coordinates logged and flagged for follow-up investigation. The survey continued, but that night, according to a postdoctoral researcher who spoke anonymously to a Montana journalist in 2008, Dr. Okonkwo sat alone on the deck of the vessel for over an hour, staring at the water where the anomaly had appeared. She never published findings related to the incident. Elias Marchetti transferred to a university in New England before the fall semester began. He has declined interview requests for 30 years, though a cousin who spoke to a documentary researcher in 2019 offered a partial account of a conversation they'd had shortly after the survey. He said the sonar wasn't broken, the cousin recalled. That was what bothered him. If it had malfunctioned, they would have found a malfunction. They tested it afterward, ran diagnostics, checked everything. It was working perfectly. So either the lake has a hole in it that's 500 feet deeper than it should be, or the sonar was reading something that isn't depth at all. He couldn't figure out which possibility was worse. When asked why Marchetti left Montana, the cousin paused before answering. He said he started dreaming about it. The number, 917. He'd wake up in the middle of the night with that number in his head, and he couldn't explain why it felt like a warning. Local fishing guides who work the southern basin have their own accounts, though most share them reluctantly. A guide named Russell Whitehorse, who has operated charter boats on Flathead Lake since 1984, described an experience from the summer of 2002. "I've dropped anchor in Skidoo Bay maybe 500 times, Whitehorse said in a 2015 interview. That day the anchor didn't catch. Line kept going out, way more than it should have. I had 150 feet of rope, and it went slack at the end. No bottom. I pulled it back up and tried again, same spot, and it caught at 50 feet like always. Didn't make sense. Still doesn't." A retired dive instructor named Margaret Solberg, who led certification courses in Flathead Lake during the 1990s, offered a different kind of testimony. She described a dive in August of 1996, during which she descended to approximately 180 feet, well within the lake's established safe range. "Below about 150 feet, the water changes," Solberg said. "It's not just darker or colder, it's heavier. That's not the right word, but it's the only one I have. And there's a point where you stop feeling like you're in water at all. It's more like you're in something that's pretending to be water, something that knows you're there." Solberg stopped diving in Flathead Lake after that summer. She did not elaborate on why. The Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks has conducted periodic depth surveys of Flathead Lake since 1993. none have replicated the anomaly recorded by the University of Montana team. Official statements characterize the incident as an instrument calibration irregularity that was resolved through subsequent testing. However, a Freedom of Information request filed in 2012 by a Missoula-based journalist revealed that the original survey data from June 1993 had been partially redacted. The coordinates where the anomaly occurred were removed, replaced with a notation reading "Data under review." The journalist filed an appeal. The appeal was denied without explanation. Dr. Okonkwo retired from the University of Montana in 2004. Her published work on Flathead Lake covers water chemistry, invasive species management, and temperature stratification. It contains no references to depth anomalies or the 1993 survey. Colleagues who worked with her describe a meticulous scientist who rarely discussed unverifiable findings. One former student, speaking off the record, said she once asked Dr. Okonkwo directly about the Skidoo Bay readings. "She looked at me for a long time," the student recalled. Then she said, "Some data teaches you what questions not to ask. I never brought it up again." Geological surveys of the Flathead Valley show no evidence of subsurface caverns, volcanic vents, or tectonic features that could account for a localized depth increase of 500 feet. The lake bottom in the southern basin is composed of glacial sediment and clay, stable, unremarkable, thoroughly mapped. Except, apparently, for the 90 seconds on June 19, 1993, when it wasn't. Salish elders who have been asked about the incident have generally declined to comment in detail. One elder, speaking to an anthropology student in 2007, offered only a brief response. "The lake is old, older than the mountains. Some parts of it remember things that haven't happened yet." When asked to clarify, he shook his head. "You already know more than you should," he said. "That's the problem." Flathead Lake remains one of Montana's most popular recreational destinations. Tourists swim in its shallows each summer. Boats trace its surface in lazy arcs. Real estate along its shores sells for millions of dollars. The official depth is 370 feet. Every map says so. Every guidebook confirms it. But fishermen still sometimes lose more anchor line than they should. Divers still describe a feeling they can't explain. And somewhere in a university archive, a data log from 1993 contains a number that should not exist, redacted but not erased, questioned but never answered. 917 feet, 3 passes. Then nothing. The lake keeps its depth, and the depth keeps its secrets. And if you look at the water on a very calm day, when the surface becomes a mirror and the sky folds into itself, you might notice that your reflection seems further away than it should be, deeper than it should be, watching you from somewhere the instruments can't reach. Fire doesn't hesitate. That's what every firefighter learns first. Man Gulch is a steep, V-shaped drainage carved into the eastern slope of the Rocky Mountain front, roughly 20 miles north of Helena, Montana. The gulch opens toward the Missouri River, its walls rising sharply on both sides. Grassy slopes dotted with ponderosa pine and Douglas fir, prone to drying out by late summer and igniting with little provocation. In 1949, it was accessible only by boat or aircraft. Today, it remains one of the more remote corners of the Helena National Forest, visited mostly by wildfire researchers and the occasional hiker making a pilgrimage to the white crosses that still mark where 13 men died. The fire that killed them started on August 4th, likely from lightning that struck during a storm the previous afternoon. By the following day, August 5th, it had been spotted by a ranger station lookout and reported to the regional smoke jumper base in Missoula. A crew of 15 men was dispatched, led by Foreman R. Wagner Dodge, a veteran with nearly a decade of experience fighting backcountry fires. The jump went smoothly. The men landed in the gulch at approximately 4 in the afternoon, gathered their equipment, and began hiking toward the fire, which appeared small and manageable from their vantage point. Weather conditions were hot and dry, but not unusual for early August in Montana. What happened over the next 2 hours would become the subject of intense investigation, academic study, and eventually a celebrated book by Norman Maclean. But there is a version of events that Maclean never wrote, because he was never given access to it. The official timeline is well documented. At approximately 5:45 in the afternoon, the fire crossed the gulch and began racing uphill toward the smoke jumpers, driven by superheated air and steep terrain. Foreman Dodge ordered his men to drop their heavy tools and run. When he realized they could not outpace the flames, he performed an act of desperate innovation. He lit an escape fire, burning a small patch of grass in front of him, then lay down in the ashes, allowing the main fire to pass over him. Dodge survived. So did 2 others, Walter Rumsey and Robert Sally, who managed to scramble through a crevice in the ridge before the fire overtook them. The remaining 13 men died within minutes, most of them found within 300 yards of the ridgeline. The youngest was 17 years old. The Forest Service conducted a formal investigation over the following months. Interviews were conducted with all 3 survivors, independently and under oath. These depositions were sealed as part of the agency's internal review process and were not made public for over 50 years. In 2001, under a Freedom of Information Act request filed by a graduate student at the University of Montana, portions of the depositions were declassified. The student, whose name was later withheld from press coverage at her own request, had been researching historical fire behavior for her dissertation. What she found, or rather what she didn't find, changed the direction of her research entirely. Each deposition contained a gap, not a redaction, but a physical absence, pages removed from the binding, with no explanation or notation. The numbering skipped from page 14 to page 19 in Rumsey's account, from 12 to 18 in Sally's, and from 16 to 22 in Dodge's. The surrounding text in all 3 documents contained fragments of the same sentence structure, as if the survivors had been asked identical questions and given similar answers. The fragments, pieced together from context, suggested a discussion of fire behavior during a specific window of time, approximately 5:40 to 5:41 in the afternoon. The fragments also contained a phrase that appeared in all 3 depositions: moved backward. Toriu. Walter Rumsey died in 1980. Robert Sally died in 2014. R. Wagner Dodge died of Hodgkin's lymphoma in 1955, just 6 years after the fire. But before their deaths, each man spoke at least once to researchers or journalists about what they witnessed in Man Gulch. Rumsey, in a 1974 interview with a Montana television station, described the moment the fire crowned, leaping from ground fuels into the treetops and generating its own wind. When asked if there was anything unusual about the fire's behavior, he paused for several seconds before answering. "It stopped," he said. "Not died down. Stopped, like it was thinking. Then it came at us faster than anything I've ever seen." The interviewer asked him to clarify. Rumsey shook his head. "I've said too much already." Sally was more forthcoming in a 2003 interview conducted for a documentary that was never completed. The footage, obtained by an independent researcher in 2016, shows Sally sitting in his living room in Washington State, speaking quietly. "The fire retreated," Sally said. "I know how that sounds. But I watched it pull back, maybe 50, 60 feet, like it was taking a breath. We all saw it. Some of the guys actually stopped running because they thought it was dying. Then it reversed, and it was on us before we could react. That's when most of them died, in that moment of hesitation. When asked why he had never mentioned this publicly before, Sally looked away from the camera. They told us not to. The investigators said it would confuse people, cause panic. Said fire doesn't behave that way, so we must have been mistaken. But we weren't mistaken. All three of us saw the same thing. Dodge himself left behind no recorded interviews. But his widow, Patricia Dodge, gave a single statement to a journalist in 1968, 13 years after her husband's death. Wagner never talked about the fire, she said. Not to me, not to anyone. But once, near the end, he said something I never understood. He said, the fire was waiting for them. It knew they would stop. The Forest Service's official report on the Man Gulch fire attributes the disaster to a combination of factors: extreme weather conditions, steep terrain, inadequate communication, and the crew's unfamiliarity with the specific geography of the gulch. The report makes no mention of anomalous fire behavior. Fire science has advanced considerably since 1949. Researchers now understand phenomena like blow-up fires, flashovers, and fire whirls, sudden escalations in fire behavior caused by specific atmospheric and topographic conditions. The Man Gulch fire has been studied extensively as an example of how quickly conditions can change in mountainous terrain. But no existing model of fire behavior accounts for what the survivors described: a fire that retreated before advancing. Dr. Leonard Osborne, a retired fire behavior analyst who worked for the National Interagency Fire Center in Boise, reviewed the available evidence in 2018 at the request of a journalist investigating the case. Osborne had access to weather records, topographic maps, and the partial depositions he leased in 2001. The conditions that day were consistent with rapid fire spread, Osborne said in his assessment. What they're not consistent with is any kind of regression. Fire follows fuel and oxygen. It doesn't reverse direction without a change in wind, and the wind records from that day show no such change during the relevant time window. When asked what could explain the survivors' accounts, Osborne was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know," he finally said. "I've studied fire for 40 years. Fire doesn't hesitate. Fire doesn't retreat. Fire doesn't wait." But 3 men, interviewed separately, described exactly that. Either they were all lying, or something happened in that gulch that we don't have a framework to understand. The missing pages from the depositions have never been recovered. A 2012 inquiry to the National Archives produced no additional documentation. The Forest Service declined to comment on the discrepancy, citing the age of the records and the difficulty of locating materials from that era. The graduate student who filed the original FOIA-OI request completed her dissertation in 2004. It focused on fire behavior modeling, with no mention of Man Gulch. She currently works in wildfire risk assessment for a private firm. She has not responded to interview requests regarding her research. "13 white crosses still stand on the hillside above Man Gulch. The trail that leads to them is steep and unmarked. Most visitors make the hike in late summer, when the grass is dry and golden and the air smells faintly of smoke from distant fires. Some who have made the climb report a strange sensation near the top of the ridge, a feeling of being watched, or of time moving differently than it should. A park ranger who patrols the area described finding a tourist in 2019 standing motionless near the crosses, staring downhill toward the gulch. When the ranger asked if he was all right, the man turned slowly. "Did you hear that?" he asked. The ranger heard nothing. "It sounded like fire," the man said, "but going the wrong direction." He left without giving his name. the ranger filed no formal report. There was nothing officially to report. Fire doesn't hesitate. Fire doesn't think. Fire doesn't wait. But in Man Gulch, on August 5, 1949, something did, and 13 men ran toward a ridgeline they would never reach, in the 40 seconds it took for the fire to decide they had hesitated long enough. Some buildings refuse to stay empty. Garnet sits at the end of a rutted dirt road in the Garnet Range of western Montana, approximately 30 miles east of Missoula. In the 1890s, it was a boom town of nearly 1,000 residents, built on the promise of gold extracted from the surrounding hills. Hotels, saloons, a school, and a doctor's office lined its main street. The assay office, where miners brought their ore to be weighed and valued, stood at the center of town, a 2-story wooden structure with a false front designed to make it look more imposing than it was. By 1912, the gold was gone. By 1930, so were the people. Today, Garnet is one of Montana's best-preserved ghost towns, maintained by the Bureau of Land Management as a historical site. Approximately 30 structures remain standing, their wood weathered to a silver gray that photographs well in the thin mountain light. Visitors can walk the streets in summer, peer through windows, and imagine what life might have been like when the stamp mills ran day and night. But visitors are not permitted after dark. The official reason is safety. The buildings are fragile, the roads unlit, and the nearest medical facility is an hour away. Rangers who have worked the site for years offer a different explanation, though rarely on the record. The assay office, they say, is not always empty. The first documented report came from a seasonal ranger named Donald Pavlak in August of 1987. Pavlak had been hired to conduct overnight patrols of the ghost town following a series of vandalism incidents earlier that summer. His shift ran from 10 in the evening until 6 in the morning, and for the first 3 weeks, he reported nothing unusual. On August 14th, Pavlak noted in his patrol log that he had observed illumination consistent with lantern or candlelight in the second-floor window of the assay office at approximately 2:15 in the morning. He approached the building, found the door secured, and saw no evidence of entry. By the time he circled to view the window from another angle, the light had extinguished. Pavlak searched the building at dawn. He found no lanterns, no candles, no wiring, and no signs of recent occupation. The dust on the floor appeared undisturbed. He reported the incident to his supervisor, a senior ranger named Constance Munoz, who drove out from Missoula to inspect the site. Munoz found nothing to explain the light. She noted in her own report, however, that the temperature inside the assay office was noticeably warmer than ambient conditions, despite no apparent heat source. Over the following weeks, Pavlak observed the light 3 more times. Each occurrence fell between 2 and 2:40 in the morning. Each time the light appeared in the same second-floor window. Each time it vanished before he could reach the building. Pavlak requested a transfer at the end of the season. His transfer paperwork, obtained through a public records request in 2009, contains a handwritten note in the margin. Does not wish to discuss Garnet assignment. The pattern Pavlak established has repeated with unsettling consistency over the following decades. Rangers, researchers, and on rare occasions, trespassers have reported the same phenomenon: a faint, warm light in the assay office, visible only during a specific 40-minute window in the early morning hours, and only during months when the moon is not full. A wildlife biologist named Sandra Oyalaran conducted an informal investigation in 1994 while stationed in the region for an unrelated study on pine marten populations. Oyelaran had heard rumors about the ghost town from other BLM employees and decided to spend several nights observing the site with a thermal imaging camera borrowed from her university. On her third night, September 22nd, she captured footage that she has never publicly released. In a 2011 interview with a Montana magazine, she described what the camera showed. The thermal signature in the assay office was consistent with a wood-burning stove, Oyelaran said. A concentrated heat source, roughly 3 feet by 2 feet, radiating outward. The temperature differential was significant, maybe 40 degrees warmer than the surrounding structure. But there's no stove in that building. There hasn't been a stove there since the 1920s. When asked if she had an explanation, Oyelaran shook her head. I'm a biologist, not a physicist. I can tell you what the camera recorded. I can't tell you what it means. She paused before adding, I went inside the next morning. The floor where the heat signature appeared was warm to the touch. Not hot. Warm, like something had been there and recently left. A local historian named Jerome Whitfield, who has written extensively about Garnet and other Montana ghost towns, has collected testimony from over a dozen witnesses since 1992. Most describe the light. A few describe something else. There was a woman who worked as a caretaker in the early 2000s, Whitfield said in a 2018 podcast interview. She told me she'd found footprints in the dust inside the assay office, boot prints, old-fashioned, like something from the mining era. They started at the door and led to the east wall, then stopped. No prints leading back, no prints anywhere else. Just this one set of tracks, appearing overnight, leading to a wall. Whitfield visited the site himself to document the prints. By the time he arrived, they were gone. The Bureau of Land Management has never issued an official statement regarding the anomalies at Garnet. Internal communications obtained through Freedom of Information requests reveal a pattern of acknowledgement, followed by dismissal. A 1998 memo from the regional office in Butte instructed field staff to log all unusual observations per standard protocol, but also to refrain from speculation in written reports. A 2004 email chain discussed the possibility of installing motion-activated cameras in the assay office. The proposal was rejected due to budget constraints and preservation concerns. No cameras have ever been installed. No formal investigation has been conducted. Independent researchers have attempted to fill the void. A team from Montana State University's physics department visited Garnet in 2007 to take electromagnetic readings throughout the town. Their findings, published in an obscure regional journal, noted anomalous fluctuations in the assay office that did not correspond to any identifiable source. The lead researcher, Dr. Annika Lindqvist, described the readings as frustrating. We measured spikes in electromagnetic activity between roughly 2 and 2:30 in the morning, Lindqvist said. The pattern was consistent across 3 nights of observation, but we couldn't identify a cause. There's no electrical infrastructure in the building. There's no equipment. There's nothing that should produce that kind of signature. When asked if the readings could be explained by natural phenomena, Lindqvist hesitated. Possibly, she said, geological activity, atmospheric conditions. There are explanations we haven't ruled out. But the timing is what bothers me. The same 40-minute window every night we observed. Natural phenomena don't usually keep a schedule. The assay office itself has been examined by structural engineers and preservationists multiple times. The east wall, where witnesses report the footprints terminate, shows no unusual features. The plaster is original, applied sometime in the late 1890s. It has cracked and yellowed with age, but remains largely intact, except for the marks. A preservation specialist named Yuki Tanaka, who surveyed the building in 2012, noted a series of faint impressions near the base of the east wall, approximately 3 feet from the floor. The marks, she wrote in her report, were consistent with fingernail scratches, though heavily weathered. She estimated their age at several decades, possibly older. Tanaka's report recommended no further action. The marks, she concluded, were likely the result of previous vandalism or structural settling. She did not explain how structural settling could produce the shape of human fingernails. Garnet remains open to visitors during daylight hours. The assay office stands where it has always stood, its windows dark, its floors thick with dust that seems to resettle differently each morning. Rangers still patrol the site, though overnight shifts have been quietly discontinued since 2015. No one has officially explained why. The thermal signatures continue to be reported, though less frequently now that fewer personnel spend nights in the area. The footprints still appear, according to those who claim to have seen them, always the same path, always ending at the same wall, always gone by dawn. Jerome Whitfield, the historian, visited Garnet for the last time in 2020. He stood outside the assay office as the sun set, watching the shadows lengthen across the empty street. "I've studied this town for 30 years, he said later. "I know every building, every foundation, every grave in the cemetery. But I've never set foot in the assay office after dark. Not once." When asked why, he considered the question for a long moment. "Because I think someone's already there," he said, "and I don't think they want to be found." The lights still appear. The stove that doesn't exist still warms the air. The footprints still walk toward a wall that leads nowhere. And somewhere in the dust of the assay office, something keeps returning to a station that nobody staffed, at an hour when no one should be watching, to wait for something that may have already arrived. Someone knew where to look before anyone knew how to find it. Sweetgrass County stretches across south-central Montana, a patchwork of cattle ranches and wheat farms pressed against the northern face of the Crazy Mountains. The range itself rises abruptly from the plains, a compact cluster of peaks that the Crow people called Awaksawipia, often translated as ominous mountains, or more literally, mountains that are crazy. The translation has always been disputed. Some anthropologists believe the name refers to the unpredictable weather that rolls off the summits. Others suggest it describes something the Crow observed there that defied easy explanation. The town of Big Timber sits at the county's heart, population roughly 1,700. It serves as a supply point for the ranches that spread north and west toward the Yellowstone River. The land is practical, hard-working, and deeply skeptical of anything that can't be explained by weather, economics, or simple bad luck, which is why what happened on the Engstrom Ranch in the autumn of 1978 was discussed quietly, if at all. The Engstrom family had worked the same 1,200 acres since 1908, running cattle on grass that turned golden each September and stayed that way until the snow came. Harold Engstrom, 62 years old in 1978, was the third generation to manage the property. He was not a man given to imagination. His neighbors described him as practical to the point of stubbornness, the kind of rancher who checked his fences every week and kept records of rainfall in notebooks dating back 40 years. On the morning of October 9, 1978, Harold Engstrom rode out to check on a section of pasture near the base of Crazy Peak. What he found there would occupy him for the remaining years of his life. The stones were arranged in a clearing approximately 50 yards from a seasonal creek. There were 47 of them in total, each roughly the size of a man's fist, each placed with deliberate precision. They formed no recognizable pattern, not a circle, not a spiral, not any symbol Harold could identify. They simply sat in the grass, evenly spaced, as if someone had been interrupted mid-thought. Harold assumed vandalism at first. Hikers occasionally wandered onto his property from the adjacent Forest Service land, and he had dealt with cut fences and campfire remains before. But something about the arrangement troubled him. The stones were local granite, the same type that littered the creek bed a quarter-mile away. Whoever had placed them had carried nearly 200 pounds of rock to a pasture with no road access. He photographed the stones. Harold owned a Polaroid camera he used to document fence damage for insurance purposes, and left them undisturbed. That evening, he mentioned the discovery to his wife, Mary Ann, who suggested he call the sheriff. The sheriff's deputy who arrived the following day was a young man named Peter Kowalczyk. He examined the stones, took his own photographs, and admitted he had no idea what he was looking at. "Probably kids," he told Harold. "Some kind of prank." But Kowalczyk was curious enough to sketch the arrangement in his notebook. Years later, he would show that sketch to a friend who worked in military communications. The friend studied it for several minutes, then asked where the stones had been found. "It's a number sequence," the friend said. "Specifically, it's 2 number sequences, latitude and longitude. Whoever made this was encoding coordinates." The coordinates, when calculated, pointed to a location 11 miles northwest of the Engstrom Ranch, high in the Crazy Mountains. The problem was the date, October of 1978. The global positioning system would not be available for civilian use until 1983. The satellite constellation that made GPS possible was still being launched. Whoever arranged those stones had used a navigation system that did not yet exist. Harold Engstrom never hiked to the coordinates himself. By the time the significance of the arrangement was understood, he was in his late 70s and in declining health. But he spoke about the stones to anyone who would listen: his children, his neighbors, the occasional journalist who passed through Big Timber researching stories about Montana's stranger corners. His grandson, a man named Eric Engstrom, recorded a conversation with Harold in 1996, 2 years before the old rancher's death. The recording, preserved on cassette tape, captures Harold's voice clearly. "I went back to that pasture every spring for 15 years, Harold says on the tape. The stones were always there, exactly where I found them. Never moved, never scattered by animals, never buried by snow. 47 stones, same positions. Then one spring, must have been 91 or 92, they were gone. All of them, not scattered, gone. The grass where they had been was dead, brown circles. 47 of them, like the stones had burned the ground underneath." Eric asks his grandfather if he had any theory about who placed the stones. Harold is quiet for a long moment. "I think something wanted us to find that place in the mountains," he finally says. "And I think it's been waiting a long time for someone to look." Peter Kowalczyk, the deputy who first documented the stones, retired from law enforcement in 2003. In a 2014 interview with a podcast investigating unexplained phenomena in Montana, he discussed the case reluctantly. "I've thought about those stones for 35 years, Kowalczyk said. "The math checks out. The coordinates are real. The encoding is consistent with standard notation. But GPS didn't exist yet. Not for civilians. Hell, barely for the military. So either someone with classified access to satellite positioning decided to arrange rocks in a Montana pasture, or we're dealing with something I don't have a framework for. Neither explanation makes me comfortable." The coordinates pointed to an unnamed drainage high on the western slope of Crazy Peak, accessible only by a 12-mile hike through national forest. The area sees few visitors. The terrain is steep, the weather unpredictable, and there are no established trails. In August of 1983, the same year civilian GPS came online, a group of hikers from Bozeman attempted to reach the location. They were experienced backcountry travelers led by a woman named Delia Sandoval, who had summited most of the major peaks in the region. What they found has never been adequately explained. Approximately 200 yards from the calculated coordinates, the group discovered a shallow depression in the earth, roughly circular, perhaps 15 feet in diameter, with no obvious cause. The soil at the bottom of the depression was unusually compacted, as if pressed down by enormous weight. Scattered across the depression were 17 sets of human dentures. The dentures varied widely in age and manufacture. Some appeared to be modern, pink acrylic bases, porcelain teeth. Others were decades older, with vulcanite rubber that hadn't been used in dental work since the 1940s. One set, according to Sandoval's later account, appeared to be made entirely of carved bone. The hikers photographed the site and reported their findings to the Sweet Grass County Sheriff's Office upon their return. A search and rescue team was dispatched the following week to investigate. The official report, filed in September of 1983, describes the location but makes no mention of the dentures. When Sandoval inquired about the discrepancy, she was told that no human remains or artifacts had been found at the site. The photographs she had taken, which she had submitted to the sheriff's office, were returned to her with several frames missing. "They kept 4 of my photos," Sandoval said in a 2007 interview, "the ones that showed the dentures clearly. I got back pictures of trees, rocks, the depression, but nothing that showed what was actually in it." The Montana State Crime Lab has no record of any dental analysis connected to the Sweet Grass County case. Missing persons databases show no matches for dentures recovered in the Crazy Mountains. The site itself, when visited by subsequent hikers, has been described as unremarkable, a shallow depression, empty, surrounded by ordinary forest. The dentures, if they existed, have vanished. Harold Engstrom died in 1998. He is buried in the Big Timber Cemetery within sight of the Crazy Mountains. His grandson Eric still manages the family ranch, though he sold the pasture, where the stones appeared in 2011. The new owners, a couple from California who planned to build a vacation home, abandoned the project after a single summer. In a brief conversation with a local realtor, they mentioned only that they found the property unsuitable. The land has sat empty since. The 47 brown circles Harold described, the dead spots where the stones once rested, have never fully recovered. Satellite imagery from 2019 shows them faintly, still visible 40 years later, arranged in a pattern that matches no known symbol but encodes a location where 17 sets of teeth once waited for someone to find them. No one knows who placed the stones. No one knows whose mouths once held the dentures, and no one can explain how coordinates written in rock predicted a navigation system that wouldn't exist for another 5 years. The Crazy Mountains keep their secrets. They have been keeping them, by some estimates, for a very long time. And somewhere in a drainage that doesn't appear on any trail map, a shallow depression waits. Empty now, perhaps, or perhaps simply emptied of what visitors were meant to see. The coordinates are still accurate. The location still exists. Some things are patient. Some things have always known exactly where they are. Six men came home from a routine flight. 6 men were already there. Malmstrom Air Force Base sprawls across nearly 3,400 acres of high plains east of Great Falls, Montana. Established in 1942 as Great Falls Army Air Base, it served as a training facility during World War II and later became a critical node in America's nuclear deterrent infrastructure. By the mid-1960s, Malmstrom housed a significant portion of the nation's Minuteman missile arsenal, its silos scattered across the surrounding prairie like seeds planted by a careful but paranoid hand. The base also maintained a substantial bomber presence. B-52 Stratofortresses flew regular training routes over the northern Rockies, practicing low-level penetration tactics and simulated attack runs. The missions were routine to the point of tedium. Long hours in pressurized cabins, watching instruments, following checklists. Crews rotated through assignments with the regularity of shift workers at a factory. The landscape surrounding Malmstrom reinforced the monotony. Wheat fields stretched to every horizon, interrupted only by grain elevators and the occasional ranch house. The sky dominated everything, vast, indifferent, capable of producing weather that could shift from clear to deadly within minutes. Pilots who flew out of Malmstrom learned to respect the emptiness. Some learned to fear it. In 1967, the base was operating at peak Cold War readiness. Security protocols were strict. Documentation was meticulous. Every flight was logged, every landing recorded, every crew member accounted for. The system was designed to eliminate ambiguity, which is what makes the events of March 14th so difficult to reconcile. The aircraft in question was a B-52D, tail number 56062, assigned to the 322nd Bombardment Squadron. The crew consisted of 6 men. Aircraft Commander Major Theodore Jansen, co-pilot Captain Leonard Ferreira, radar navigator. Captain Douglas Ashworth, navigator First Lieutenant Paul Strickland, electronic warfare officer Captain William Ostergaard, and tail gunner Staff Sergeant Raymond Bautista. According to the official flight log, the aircraft departed Malmstrom at 1400 hours on March 14th for a standard 12-hour training mission over eastern Montana and western North Dakota. Weather conditions were clear. No anomalies were noted during pre-flight inspection. The crew reported in at scheduled intervals throughout the mission. At 23:47 hours, 11:47 in the evening, the aircraft touched down at Malmstrom. Tower personnel logged the landing. Ground crews met the plane on the tarmac. The 6 crew members disembarked, completed their post-flight paperwork, and were dismissed to crew quarters. The problem was discovered the following morning by a maintenance supervisor named Gerald Wysotsky. Wysotsky had been reviewing hangar assignments when he noticed a discrepancy. According to his records, aircraft 56062 had been towed to Hangar 6 at 21:45 hours, 9:45 in the evening, following a landing at 21:22. The hangar log showed the aircraft had arrived with its crew, who completed post-flight procedures and departed the base by 2200 hours. Wysotsky checked the tower log. It confirmed the 11:47 landing. He checked the hangar log again. It confirmed the 9:22 landing. The same aircraft had landed twice, more than 2 hours apart. The same 6 men had debriefed twice, signed out twice, gone home twice. Wysotsky reported the discrepancy to his commanding officer. By noon, the matter had been elevated to base intelligence. The crew was interviewed separately over the following 3 days. The interviews were conducted by Air Force Office of Special Investigations personnel and were classified immediately upon completion. Partial transcripts were declassified in 1998 under a routine document review, though significant portions remain redacted. What the transcripts reveal is that the 6 crew members did not agree on when they had landed. Major Jansen, Captain Ferreira, and Staff Sergeant Bautista all stated clearly that they had landed at approximately 23:45, consistent with the tower log. They described a normal approach, a normal touchdown, normal post-flight procedures. Jansen specifically recalled checking his watch as they taxied to the parking area. Captain Ashworth, Lieutenant Strickland, and Captain Ostergaard remembered differently. They stated that the aircraft had landed shortly after 2100 hours, consistent with the hangar log. Ashworth recalled commenting to Strickland that they had made good time. Ostergaard remembered signing his post-flight checklist at 21:30. All 6 men agreed on one point. They had flown a single mission and landed once. When confronted with the documentary evidence, 2 sets of logs, 2 landing times, 2 parallel paper trails, the crew members expressed confusion but not surprise. Several described a sense of wrongness during the final hours of the flight, though none could articulate what had felt wrong. Staff Sergeant Bautista, speaking to an investigator on March 17th, offered the only specific observation. Somewhere over the high line, I looked out the tail station and saw something I couldn't explain, Bautista said, according to the transcript. It was like the sky had a seam in it, a line where the stars didn't quite match up. I blinked, and it was gone. I didn't report it because I figured I was tired. But now I wonder if that was the moment it happened. When asked what it referred to, Bautista declined to elaborate. A civilian air traffic controller named Dolores Kaminsky, who worked the night shift at Great Falls International Airport on March 14th, provided peripheral corroboration. In an interview conducted decades later for a local history project, Kaminsky mentioned that she had tracked unusual radar returns west of the city that evening. 2 blips where there should have been one, Kaminsky recalled. Overlapping, like an echo, but moving independently. I logged it as instrument malfunction, but I'd never seen that kind of return before or since. The Air Force investigation into the March 14th incident lasted approximately 6 weeks. The final report, completed in late April 1967, has never been fully declassified. A summary released in 2003 describes the incident as a documentation error compounded by crew fatigue and inconsistent record-keeping. This explanation satisfied no one who examined the evidence closely. The tower log and hangar log were maintained by different personnel using different systems. The tower controller who recorded the 1147 landing was a 15-year veteran with no history of errors. The hangar supervisor who logged the 922 arrival was similarly experienced. Both men stood by their records under questioning. The aircraft itself showed no signs of mechanical anomaly. Post-flight inspection revealed normal wear consistent with a 12-hour mission. Fuel consumption matched flight plan projections. The only notable observation, buried in the maintenance report, was a comment from a crew chief named Victor Palmieri. Airframe unusually cold upon arrival, despite standard engine operation during taxi. Palmieri was not asked to elaborate, and no follow-up investigation was conducted. The 6 crew members continued their service at Malmstrom without incident. None requested transfer. None sought psychological evaluation, but personnel records show that within 18 months, all 6 had left active flight duty, an unusually high attrition rate for a single crew. 3 cited family reasons. 2 accepted ground assignments. 1, Captain Ostergaard, resigned his commission entirely. Ostergaard died in 2019. His daughter, speaking to a journalist researching Cold War aviation mysteries, shared a conversation she had with her father in his final weeks. "He told me he never flew again after 67, she said. Not military, not civilian, not even small planes. I asked him why, and he said, because I'm not sure I ever really landed. I'm not sure any of us did." When asked what he meant, Ostergaard had simply shaken his head. "We came back wrong," he said. "We came back twice." Malmstrom Air Force Base remains operational today, still housing a substantial portion of America's nuclear missile force. The 322nd Bombardment Squadron was deactivated in 1975 as part of a broader reorganization, Aircraft 56. 062 was retired from service in 1983 and scrapped at Davis Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona. No physical evidence of the March 14 incident remains, but in the classified archives somewhere, assuming they haven't been destroyed, 2 sets of logs still exist, 2 landing times, 2 parallel realities documented by men who had no reason to lie and no explanation for what they recorded. 6 men flew out over Montana on a clear spring day in 1967. 6 men landed at 11:47. 6 men had already landed at 9:22. Both statements are true. Neither should be possible. The sky over the High Line is still vast, still empty, still capable of holding secrets that instruments can't measure and paperwork can't reconcile. And somewhere in the memory of men now dead, a seam in the stars opened and closed, leaving behind nothing but 2 signatures on 2 forms, proof that something happened, and proof that it happened twice. The plane landed. The plane had already landed. The crew came home. The crew was already there. The dead don't need telephones. But someone in Pony kept calling anyway. Pony sits in a narrow valley at the base of the Tobacco Root Mountains, roughly 35 miles west of Bozeman in southwestern Montana. The town was founded in 1875 after gold was discovered in the creek that runs through its center, Pony Creek, named for a crow horse found grazing near the original strike. Within a decade, the population had swelled to over 5,000. Stamp mills ran around the clock. Saloons lined the main street. A schoolhouse, a church, and a company store gave the settlement the appearance of permanence. By 1920, the gold was exhausted. By 1950, the population had fallen below 300. The stamp mills were dismantled. The saloons closed. The company store became a private residence, then an abandoned shell, then a ruin slowly collapsing into the basement that had once held supplies for 1,000 miners. What remained was a handful of houses, a small post office, and an infrastructure that had been built for a town 10 times the size, including a telephone exchange that continued to serve the valley long after the need for it had faded. The exchange was housed in a small brick building on the north end of Pony's main street. It had been constructed in 1923 by Mountain States Telephone and Telegraph, part of a broader effort to connect rural Montana communities to the national network. At its peak, the exchange served over 200 lines. By 1991, it served fewer than 40. That was the year the company decided to shut it down. The decommission was scheduled for September of 1991. A crew of 3 technicians, led by a supervisor named Martin Horvath, drove out from Bozeman to disconnect the equipment and transfer the remaining active lines to a digital switching station in Three Forks. The work was expected to take 2 days. It took nearly 3 weeks. On the first afternoon, while testing the lines prior to disconnection, one of the technicians, a young man named Bradley Nkomo, reported an anomaly. An incoming call had registered on the switchboard from a line that, according to company records, had been disconnected in 1947. The line had belonged to a residence on Pony's east side, a house that had burned down in 1952. Nkomo answered the call. He heard no voice, only a faint rhythmic clicking. Over the following hours, more calls came. All originated from numbers that had been inactive for decades. Some traced to addresses that no longer existed. The clicking was present on every line, the same pattern repeating without variation. Horvath, the supervisor, initially assumed equipment malfunction. The exchange was old, wiring degraded over time. He ordered his crew to begin a systematic inspection of the system. They found nothing wrong. The equipment was functioning within normal parameters. The incoming calls, according to every diagnostic available, were real. By the end of the first week, the crew had logged over 70 calls from disconnected numbers. Horvath began keeping a personal record, noting the time, duration, and originating number of each call. The pattern was consistent. Calls came primarily between 2 and 4 in the morning, lasted between 30 seconds and 2 minutes, and contained nothing but the clicking sound. On September 12th, Horvath played a recording of the clicking for the only other person in the crew with military experience, a technician named Dale Overby, who had served in the Navy as a communications specialist. Overby listened for less than a minute before identifying it. "That's Morse code," he said. "Slow, but clear. It's repeating 2 words. Still here." The remaining residents of Pony were reluctant to discuss the calls. Most were elderly, descendants of mining families who had never left. They had grown up with the exchange, used it their entire lives, and seemed unsurprised when Horvath described what his crew was experiencing. An 83-year-old woman named Genevieve Purcell, whose family had lived in Pony since 1881, offered the only direct comment recorded from a local resident. "The phones have always done that," Purcell told Horvath, according to notes he kept from the conversation. "Not all the time, but enough. My mother used to get calls from her sister's number years after her sister died. She'd answer, and there'd be nothing but that tapping. She said it was just the wires remembering." When asked what she meant by the wires remembering, Purcell declined to elaborate. A former postmaster named Arthur Delacroix, who had served Pony from 1968 until 1985, provided a more detailed account in a 2004 interview with a Montana Historical Society volunteer. "I took calls at the post office for 17 years, Delacroix said. "Maybe once a month I'd get one that didn't make sense. Old numbers, deadlines, nothing on the other end but clicking. I stopped answering them after a while. But they kept coming. The ringing, it had a different quality, sharper, like the phone was trying harder to get your attention." Delacroix mentioned one call in particular, received in the winter of 1979. The number that showed up was my father's. My father had been dead for 11 years. I answered it without thinking. The clicking was there, same as always. But this time, I swear I heard something underneath it. A voice, very faint, like someone talking in another room. I couldn't make out the words. I hung up and didn't sleep that night. He never received another call from that number, but he checked periodically for years afterward. The line remained disconnected. The number was never reassigned. Mountain States. Telephone and Telegraph completed the Pony decommission on September 27, 1991, nearly 3 weeks behind schedule. The official report attributed the delay to equipment age and wiring degradation, requiring additional inspection. No mention was made of the calls. Horvath's personal logs, which he retained after leaving the company in 1994, tell a different story. He documented 112 calls from inactive numbers over the course of the project. 47 of those calls originated from lines that had been disconnected before 1950. 11 originated from numbers that, according to company archives, had never been assigned at all. The Morse code message was consistent across every call his crew recorded. Still here, still here, still here. Horvath shared his logs with a telecommunications historian named Dr. Marjorie Ostrowski in 2008. Ostrowski, who had written extensively about rural telephone infrastructure in the American West, found the documentation credible but unexplainable. "The technical aspects don't add up," Ostrowski said in a 2011 interview. "A disconnected line can't generate an outgoing call. The switching equipment physically prevents it. For these calls to register as incoming, something would have had to generate a signal from hardware that no longer existed, traveling through circuits that had been severed decades earlier. It's not possible. But the logs are detailed, consistent, and Horvath had no reason to fabricate them. When asked for a theory, Ostrowski hesitated. "I don't have one," she admitted. "The best I can offer is that something in that exchange was holding onto signals that should have dissipated long ago, like an echo that never faded. But that's not science. That's just the only language I have for something I can't explain." The brick building that housed the exchange still stands in Pony. It is privately owned and has been converted into storage space. The original switching equipment was removed in 1991 and scrapped. But cell phones, which barely function in Pony due to the surrounding terrain, have been known to behave strangely in the vicinity of the old exchange. A hiker passing through in 2016 reported receiving a text message from an unknown number while standing near the building. The message contained no words, only a string of dots and dashes. When decoded, it read, "Still here." Pony's population today hovers around 40. The post office closed in 2009. The church holds services only in summer, when seasonal residents return. The main street is quiet, the buildings weathered, the valley as isolated as it has ever been. The telephone exchange is silent now. No wires connect it to anything. No equipment hums inside its walls. But those who have lived in Pony long enough say that some nights, if you stand near the old brick building, you can hear something through the walls. Faint, rhythmic, like a finger tapping on metal. Dot, 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 dash, 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 dot, dot, dot. Still here. The message that no one sent, from numbers that no one owns, to a town that forgot how to answer. But something in Pony still remembers how to call, and it has been calling for a very long time. Seven strangers dreamed the same place. Then someone found it. Warm Springs State Hospital opened in 1877 on a stretch of high prairie in Deer Lodge County, Montana, roughly 40 miles west of Butte. It was the first psychiatric institution in the territory, built to house patients who had previously been confined in county jails, or in some cases simply released into the wilderness to fend for themselves. The original structure was a modest brick building capable of holding fewer than 50 patients. By 1912, it had expanded into a sprawling campus of dormitories, treatment facilities, and support buildings that served as the primary mental health institution for the entire state. The hospital's history is not gentle. Like most psychiatric facilities of its era, Warm Springs employed treatments that ranged from ineffective to brutal: hydrotherapy, insulin shock, lobotomies. Patients arrived from across Montana, often committed by family members who lacked the resources or willingness to care for them. Many never left. The institution's records from its early decades are incomplete. Fires destroyed portions of the archive in 1918 and again in 1943. What survives is fragmentary. Admission logs, treatment notes, death certificates, and the occasional personal document left behind by staff. It was in this fragmentary archive that a researcher named Patricia Kovalenko discovered Dr. Harlan Voss's logbook in the summer of 2000 during the partial closure of the facility's oldest buildings. The logbook was bound in black leather, its pages yellowed but legible. It covered a period from January through November of 1931. Most of its entries were routine: medication schedules, patient observations, administrative notes. But beginning in March of that year, Dr. Voss began documenting something that fell outside normal psychiatric practice. He called it the shared delusion. According to Voss's notes, the phenomenon first came to his attention on March 14, 1931, when a patient named Irene Kowalski described a recurring dream during a therapy session. Kowalski, a 38-year-old woman admitted for severe melancholia, spoke of a valley she visited each night in her sleep, a place where sound did not exist, where objects cast no shadows, and where a white tower rose from the center of a frozen lake. Voss noted the dream as unremarkable. Patients often reported vivid or unusual imagery. But 2 days later, a second patient, a 52-year-old man named Augustus Brennan, admitted for paranoid episodes, described an identical location during an unrelated session. Brennan had been housed in a separate ward from Kowalski. According to hospital records, the two had never interacted. Over the following 6 weeks, 5 more patients reported the same vision. Their descriptions matched in specific, details that Voss documented with increasing unease. The valley was surrounded by mountains that appeared to have no peaks. The lake at its center was frozen, but not cold. The white tower had no doors or windows, only a surface that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Each patient described the silence as complete. Not an absence of sound, but a presence that replaced sound, like pressure against the ears. The 7 patients ranged in age from 19 to 64. They had been admitted for different conditions. They occupied different wards. Staff confirmed that none had contact with the others. And yet, beginning in early April, all 7 began drawing the same symbol on the walls of their rooms, a circle with 7 lines radiating inward, meeting at a central point. Voss's final entry, dated November 3, 1931, reads, "I have located the valley. I understand now what they were trying to tell me. I will not return." He resigned from Warm Springs the following day and was never heard from again. Patricia Kovalenko, the researcher who discovered the logbook, spent 3 years attempting to verify its contents. Her findings, published in a 2004 article for a regional history journal, raised more questions than they answered. Hospital records confirmed that all 7 patients existed. Irene Kowalski died at Warm Springs in 1939. Augustus Brennan was discharged in 1934 and lived until 1951. The remaining 5 patients followed various trajectories. Some died at the institution, some were released, one transferred to a facility in Oregon. None left behind any additional documentation of the shared vision. Staff who worked at Warm Springs in the 1930s were, by 2000, largely deceased. But Kovalenko located a retired nurse named Henrietta Bjornstad, who had begun her career at the hospital in 1938. "I heard about the Voss patients," Bjornstad said in a 2002 interview conducted when she was 91 years old. "The older nurses talked about them, said they all went quiet around the same time, stopped speaking, stopped eating, just sat in their rooms and drew that symbol on the walls." The hospital painted over it, but it kept coming back. Different patients, same symbol. I saw it myself once in the 1950s. A young man who'd never been to Montana before. He drew it on his bedsheet with his own blood. When asked if she knew what the symbol meant, Bjornstad shook her head. Nobody did, but the older staff had a rule. If a patient mentioned the valley, you didn't ask questions. You just noted it in the chart and moved on. Asking questions was how Voss got lost. A historian of psychiatry named Dr. Franklin Osai Mensah reviewed Voss's logbook in 2009 at Kovalenko's request. His assessment was cautious. "Shared delusions do occur," Osai Mensah said. "Folie à deux, folie à plusieurs. These are documented phenomena, but they require contact between patients, transmission of ideas. What Voss describes is something different. 7 isolated individuals with no apparent connection, independently generating identical imagery. That's not a shared delusion. That's either extraordinary coincidence or something we don't have a clinical framework for." Dr. Harlan Voss left behind almost no personal records. His personnel file at Warm Springs contains only basic information. Born 1891 in Helena, medical degree from the University of Oregon, hired at Warm Springs in 1924. He was not married. His next of kin was listed as a sister in Portland, who died in 1947 without ever reporting her brother as missing. The final entry in his logbook, "I have located the valley," has been the subject of considerable speculation. Voss did not specify where the valley was located or how he had found it. His resignation letter, preserved in the hospital archive, offers no explanation. "Personal matters require my immediate departure. I regret any inconvenience." Montana state records show no death certificate for Harlan Voss. Social Security Administration files contain no record of his number being used after 1931. If he assumed a new identity, he did so without leaving a trace. If he died, his body was never found. The symbol described in his logbook, a circle with 7 inward radiating lines, continues to appear at Warm Springs. Though the hospital closed most of its residential facilities in 2010, maintenance workers report finding it scratched into walls, drawn in dust, traced on fogged windows. A security guard named Marcus Thorne, who patrolled the abandoned buildings between 2012 and 2017, described finding the symbol 3 times. "Always in different places," Thorne said in a 2018 interview. "Always fresh, like someone had just made it. But the buildings were locked. I was the only one with keys." Thorne no longer works at the site. He declined to explain why. The valley itself, if it exists, has never been identified. Montana contains no shortage of isolated valleys, silent places where sound behaves strangely and shadows fall at odd angles. Satellite imagery has been examined. Topographical maps have been searched. Nothing matching Voss's description has been found. But the 7 patients saw it clearly. They drew its symbol without ever meeting. And a doctor who should have known better went looking for a place that existed only in the minds of people he was supposed to cure. Warm Springs. State Hospital still operates in limited capacity, serving patients who require long-term psychiatric care. The oldest buildings stand empty, their windows dark, their hallways silent. The logbook is housed at the Montana Historical Society in Helena. It can be viewed by appointment. Most visitors find it unremarkable, the routine notes of a Depression-era psychiatrist documenting patients whose suffering has long since ended. But those who read carefully notice the progression, the growing specificity. The way Voss's handwriting changes in the final entries, becoming smaller, more cramped, as if he were afraid of being overheard. And they notice the last page, not the final entry, but the page after it. It is blank, except for a single drawing made in pencil, pressed hard enough to leave grooves in the paper. A circle, 7 lines, all pointing inward, towards something that has no doors, no windows, and no shadow. Towards something that 7 strangers saw in their dreams, and 1 doctor went looking for. Toward a valley that should not exist, but that someone, or something, keeps showing to people who are already lost. Animals know things we've forgotten how to hear. The Sun River begins in the Bob Marshall Wilderness, fed by snowmelt from the Continental Divide, and flows eastward for roughly 130 miles before joining the Missouri near Great Falls. It passes through some of the most productive cattle country in Montana, open rangeland backed by the dramatic uplift of the Rocky Mountain front, where the plains meet the mountains in a wall of limestone cliffs and forested slopes. The river is not particularly deep or fast along most of its length. Ranchers have been fording it with livestock for generations, driving cattle across at shallow points where the water rarely exceeds 2 or 3 feet. The crossings are routine, unremarkable, part of the seasonal rhythm that has defined life in this valley since the first homesteaders arrived in the 1880s. Except at one bend, approximately 12 miles northwest of Augusta. Here the river curves gently around a low gravel bar before straightening again toward the east. The water is shallow, rarely more than 18 inches. The bottom is firm. The banks are accessible from both sides. By every reasonable measure, it should be an ideal crossing point. But no rancher in Lewis and Clark County will drive cattle through it. And no animal, domestic or wild, will cross willingly. The bend has been known locally as the Quiet Stretch for as long as anyone can remember. The name appears in no official documents, on no maps, in no tourism materials. It exists only in the memories of people who work the land, passed down through families like a warning that doesn't require explanation. The earliest documented account of the phenomenon comes from a ranch journal kept by a homesteader named Aldous Bergstrom, whose family established a cattle operation along the Sun River in 1889. Bergstrom's journal, preserved by his descendants and donated to the Montana Historical Society in 1976, contains an entry dated September of 1893. Attempted to ford the herd at the bend below Elk Creek, Bergstrom wrote. The lead steer balked at the water's edge and would not advance. Whipped him forward, and he broke his own leg trying to turn back. Lost 3 more head in the panic. Will not attempt this crossing again. Bergstrom's entry includes a marginal note, added at some later date. Anders Lindberg says his father saw the same in '68. The Blackfeet will not camp here. Similar accounts appear in county agricultural records, Ranchers Association minutes, and private correspondence throughout the following century. The details vary, but the pattern remains consistent. Cattle approach the bend, stop, and refuse to proceed. Horses rear and throw their riders, dogs whimper and retreat. In 1954, a rancher named Donald Prue lost a valuable quarter horse at the crossing. According to his insurance claim, filed with a Helena-based company, the horse became uncontrollable at the river's edge, threw its rider, and broke both forelegs attempting to flee. Prue was a practical man, not given to exaggeration. His claim was denied on the grounds that no environmental hazard could be identified. The denial letter, preserved in Prue's family papers, contains a handwritten note from the claims adjuster. Site visited, water tested, no abnormalities found. However, I did not care to remain there after dark. Ranchers who have worked the Sun River Valley for decades speak about the Quiet Stretch with a matter-of-factness that makes the phenomenon more unsettling, not less. Vivian Gustafson, whose family has operated a cattle ranch near Augusta since 1907, described her experiences in a 2008 interview with a regional agricultural magazine. My grandfather taught my father, and my father taught me. You don't cross at the bend, Gustafson said. It adds 6 miles to drive around it, but that's just what you do. The cattle know before you do. They'll be moving fine, easy as anything, and then they hit that spot, and it's like they've seen a slaughterhouse. Panic, pure panic. I've seen cows hurt themselves badly trying to get away from nothing I could see. When asked what she believed caused the behavior, Gustafson paused. I don't know, but I'll tell you what's strange. When you're at that bend, the river goes quiet. Not just quieter, quiet. The water's moving, you can see it, but there's no sound. None. It's the only place on the river like that. My father used to say it was like the river was holding its breath. Wildlife biologists from Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks installed motion-activated cameras along the Sun River in 2012 as part of a study on elk migration patterns. The cameras were placed at regular intervals, including one positioned near the Quiet Stretch. A researcher named Samuel Odhiambo, who reviewed the footage as part of his graduate work at the University of Montana, noticed an anomaly. The camera at that location captured significantly fewer animal crossings than cameras upstream or downstream, Odhiambo said in a 2015 interview. Elk, deer, even coyotes, they all seem to detour around that specific bend. Some of the footage shows animals approaching the water, stopping, and then turning back. A few showed them running, as if startled, though nothing visible triggered the response. When asked if he had visited the site personally, Odhiambo confirmed that he had. Once, he said, I stood at the bank for maybe 20 minutes. The silence was, I don't know how to describe it, oppressive. I kept wanting to make noise just to break it. I didn't stay long. Official investigations into the quiet stretch have been minimal and inconclusive. The United States Geological Survey conducted a water quality assessment of the Sun River in 1987 that included samples from the bend. No contaminants, unusual minerals, or anomalous chemical signatures were detected. An acoustical engineer named Dr. Rebecca Nyhouse visited the site in 2004 at the request of a rancher who had heard of her work on environmental sound anomalies. Nyhouse brought specialized equipment to measure ambient noise levels and sound propagation. Her findings, shared informally with colleagues but never formally published, described what she called a localized acoustic null zone. Sound waves entering that stretch of river appear to be absorbed rather than reflected or transmitted, Nyhouse wrote in her notes. The effect is consistent regardless of time of day or weather conditions. I have no explanation for the mechanism. Natural absorption of this magnitude would require materials and conditions not present at this location. When contacted in 2019 by a journalist researching the story, Nyhouse declined to comment further. She did confirm that she had never returned to the site and had no plans to do so. Geologists have proposed various theories: subterranean cavities that might dampen sound, unusual rock formations beneath the riverbed, localized magnetic anomalies affecting animal navigation. None have been substantiated. Core samples taken from the riverbed in 2001 revealed nothing unusual. Standard alluvial sediment consistent with the rest of the river. The Blackfeet Nation, whose ancestral territory includes much of this region, has been asked about the site on several occasions. Responses have been limited. An elder named Joseph Running Bear, speaking to a documentary filmmaker in 2011, offered only a brief comment. That place has always been wrong, Running Bear said. Our people knew it before the ranchers came. We don't go there. We don't talk about why. When pressed for details, he shook his head. Some places don't belong to the world we live in. That's all I'll say. The quiet stretch remains today much as it has always been. The river flows, the water moves, and at that one bend, approximately 200 feet in length, sound stops. Ranchers continue to drive their cattle the long way around. Wildlife continues to detour. Hunters who pass through occasionally report an unsettling feeling they struggle to articulate. Not fear, exactly, but wrongness. A sense that the silence is not empty, but full of something they cannot perceive. Vivian Gustafson, now in her 70s, still works the family ranch. She has never crossed at the bend and never will. My grandson asked me once why the cows won't go through there, she said in a 2020 interview. I told him the truth. I don't know. But animals aren't stupid. They don't panic at nothing. Whatever's at that bend, whatever makes the river go quiet, the cows can sense it. They've always been able to sense it. She looked toward the mountains, visible from her kitchen window. Maybe that's the real question, not why the animals won't cross, but what they know that we don't, what they can hear in that silence that our ears aren't built for. The Sun River keeps flowing. The bend keeps its silence. And for over a century, every creature with the sense to listen has turned away from a stretch of water that looks like any other and sounds like nothing at all. Something is there. Something the cattle understand, and we never will. They refuse to cross. And perhaps that is the only answer we need. 11 men walked out of the Yak Valley in the winter of 1952. None of them ever spoke another word. The Yak River drainage occupies the extreme northwestern corner of Montana, pressed against the Canadian border and the Idaho Panhandle. It is one of the most isolated regions in the lower 48 states. A dense tangle of western red cedar, hemlock, and old-growth larch that has resisted development more successfully than almost any comparable wilderness. Roads are few and poorly maintained. Cell service, even today, is non-existent. In the 1950s, the valley was accessible only by logging roads that became impassable for much of the year. The region has always attracted people who wanted to disappear. Draft evaders settled there during World War II. Survivalists established compounds in the 1970s. The permanent population has never exceeded a few hundred, and those who live there tend to value their privacy in ways that outsiders find difficult to understand. The Yak was also, for much of the 20th century, active timber country. Logging companies maintained seasonal camps throughout the drainage, cutting old-growth forest and floating the logs down the river to mills in Troy and Libby. The work was dangerous, the conditions harsh, and the men who did it were not known for their sensitivity or imagination. The Purcell Timber Company operated in the Yak from 1938 until 1967. Their records, now housed at the University of Montana Archives, document crews, harvests, and accidents with the dry precision of corporate accounting. The records for the winter of 1952, however, contain an anomaly that has never been adequately explained. An 11-man crew entered the valley on November 15th of that year. They returned on November 29th, and according to every document that survives, not one of them ever spoke again. The crew was led by a foreman named Gunnar Halvorsen, a Norwegian immigrant who had worked for Purcell Timber since 1941. His team consisted of 10 additional men, ranging in age from 19 to 54. Their names are preserved in company payroll records: Mikkel Strand, Bojan Petrovich, Luther Yancey, Owen Katsaros, Felix Rasmussen, Delbert Woodhouse, Samuel Okonkwo, Patrick Szymanski, Clarence Dufresne, and Wendell Toomey. The crew was assigned to a remote section of the drainage known locally as Dead Horse Gulch, approximately 18 miles from the nearest maintained road. They were expected to establish a camp, fell timber for 2 weeks, and return before the first heavy snows made extraction impossible. On November 29th, the crew walked out of the forest and returned to the company's headquarters in Troy. According to the shift supervisor on duty, a man named Bernard Huxley, they arrived on foot in formation and in complete silence. Huxley's report filed the same day describes the scene in unsettling detail. The men appeared physically unharmed but would not respond to questions. Foreman Halvorsen handed me the work log without speaking. When I asked what had happened, he simply looked at me. The others did the same. I assumed they were exhausted or ill and sent them to the bunkhouse to rest. The following morning, Huxley discovered that none of the men had slept. They had sat on their bunks, awake, staring at the walls. When addressed, they did not respond. When offered food, they ate mechanically. When given paper and pencil and asked to explain their condition, each man wrote the same phrase: "We agreed." No further explanation was provided. No man on the crew ever spoke another word for the rest of his life. The company initially treated the incident as a medical emergency. A doctor from Libby named Warren Ogletree was summoned to examine the men. His report, dated December 3, 1952, found no physical abnormalities. Laryngeal function appears normal, Ogletree wrote. Reflexes intact. No evidence of stroke, trauma, or neurological impairment. The men are capable of making sounds. They cough, sneeze, and clear their throats, but they refuse to form words. This appears to be a voluntary condition, though the uniformity of the behavior suggests something more complex. When asked to elaborate in a follow-up interview conducted by a Lincoln County Sheriff's deputy, Ogletree was more candid. "I've never seen anything like it," he said. 11 men from different backgrounds, different ages, different temperaments, and they all stopped talking at the same time. Not aphasia, not shock. They chose to stop, and when you looked in their eyes, you got the feeling they'd chosen together. Family members of the crew were contacted. Most expressed confusion and distress. A sister of Luther Yancey, named Opal Yancey Morrison, traveled from Spokane to see her brother. Her account, recorded in a letter to a friend and later donated to a local historical society, describes the meeting. "Luther looked at me like I was a stranger," she wrote. "I asked him what happened in that valley. He took my hand very gently and wrote on a piece of paper, 'We agreed.' I asked him what they agreed to. He wrote, 'Not to say.' I asked him why. He looked at me for a long time, and then he wrote one more thing, 'Because it asked us.'" The letter does not record what it referred to. Opal Yancey Morrison never asked again. Luther Yancey lived until 1978. He worked as a ranch hand near Kalispell for the remainder of his life, communicating only in writing. He never explained further. Purcell Timber conducted an internal investigation in December of 1952. A company representative named Harold Ashworth was dispatched to locate the logging camp and determine what, if anything, had occurred there. Ashworth's report, submitted on December 19th, states that he was unable to find the camp. "Followed the established route to Dead Horse Gulch," Ashworth wrote. "Trail markers had been removed or were absent. Reached the approximate coordinates provided in the work order, but found no evidence of recent logging activity. No stumps, no equipment, no campsite. The area appeared undisturbed." The company sent a second team in the spring of 1953. They also failed to locate the camp. Maps of the region, cross-referenced with company records, showed no logging activity in Dead Horse Gulch that winter, despite payroll records confirming the crew had been paid for 2 weeks of work there. The Kootenai National Forest, which administered much of the surrounding land, has no documentation of any timber harvest in that section of the Yuck in 1952. Forest Service maps from the era show Dead Horse Gulch as a roadless area with no history of commercial extraction. The 11 men themselves never clarified the discrepancy. When shown maps, they would point to the general area where they had worked, but the coordinates varied each time. One researcher, a forestry student named Marion Aldridge, who investigated the case in 1971, noted that the men's gestures seemed less like they were identifying a location and more like they were warding something off. Aldridge's thesis on unexplained incidents in Montana logging history was never completed. Her notes, discovered in her estate after her death in 2003, end abruptly with a single observation. "The Yuck is larger on the inside than the outside. The maps don't account for it." Chum. The 11 men lived out their lives in the region, scattered across Lincoln and Flathead counties. They worked ordinary jobs. They raised families. Some of their descendants still live in northwestern Montana. None of them ever broke their silence. Gunnar Halverson died in 1969 at the age of 63. His wife Ingrid told a newspaper reporter in 1982 that he had been a loving husband and a devoted father. When asked about the silence, she said only, "He never seemed unhappy about it. He just didn't need to talk anymore, like he'd said everything he needed to say somewhere else." The last survivor of the crew, Wendell Toomey, died in 1994 at the age of 81. He had communicated exclusively in writing for 42 years. His final written note, found on his bedside table, contained 2 words: "Still agreed." The Yaak Valley remains one of the most isolated places in the American West. Logging has declined. The old roads are overgrown. Dead Horse Gulch does not appear on modern maps, not because it was removed, but because, according to Forest Service cartographers, it was never officially recorded in the first place. 11 men went into that valley in 1952. They came back whole, healthy, and profoundly changed. Whatever they found there, whatever they agreed to, died with them. But the silence, their silence, the valley's silence, continues. And somewhere in the Yaak, in a gulch that doesn't exist on any map, something may still be waiting for the next crew to arrive, the next group to agree, the next voices to fall quiet forever. There is a tower in the Gallatin Range that no one built, but people keep finding it anyway. The Gallatin Mountains stretch across southwestern Montana, forming the western boundary of Yellowstone National Park before extending northward toward Bozeman. The range is characterized by high alpine peaks, dense lodgepole pine forests, and valleys carved by glaciers that retreated 10,000 years ago. Much of it falls within the Gallatin National Forest, administered by the United States Forest Service since 1908. The area is well mapped. Fire lookouts were constructed throughout the range in the early 20th century, part of a nationwide effort to spot wildfires before they could spread. Most of these structures are documented exhaustively, their locations recorded, their construction dates noted, their eventual decommissioning logged in federal archives. The Forest Service knows where every official lookout stood, and most have either been maintained as historical sites or allowed to decay in place. But the structure hikers describe in the southern Gallatin does not appear in any of these records. It is said to be a tower, roughly 40 feet tall, built of gray stone that matches nothing in the surrounding geology. It stands on a ridge above the tree line, visible only from certain angles and only on clear days. Those who have seen it describe it as ancient, not weathered exactly, but old in a way that suggests it predates the Forest Service, predates the homesteaders, predates anyone who might have had reason to build such a thing in such a place. The first known photograph of the tower was taken in 1924 by a surveyor named Emil Christofferson, who was mapping timber resources for a private company. The image, now held in the Montana Historical Society archives, shows a distant structure silhouetted against the sky, too far away to reveal detail, but unmistakably artificial. Christofferson's field notes mention the tower only briefly. Stone structure observed on eastern ridge, not on current maps, did not approach. He never returned to the area. His photograph remained in the company's files until 1963, when the company dissolved and its records were donated to the state. The tower has been photographed at least 47 times since 1924. The images span nearly a century, taken by hikers, hunters, Forest Service employees, and at least one commercial pilot who spotted something from the air in 1971 and circled back to photograph it. The photographs are remarkably consistent. They show the same structure from various distances and angles, always on a ridge, always gray, always slightly too far away to see clearly. The tower appears solid, unbroken, with no visible windows or entrance. It casts a shadow that matches the sun's position at the time of each photograph, but no one has ever reached it. In the summer of 1987, a backpacker named Victor Llewellyn attempted to hike to the tower after spotting it from a trail near Hyalite Peak. Llewellyn was an experienced outdoorsman, a former Marine who had served 2 tours in Vietnam and spent his retirement exploring the backcountry of Montana and Wyoming. His journal, recovered after his death from unrelated causes in 2003, contains a detailed account of the attempt. spotted the tower at approximately 1400 hours from the ridge above Mirror Lake, Llewellyn wrote. Estimated distance, 6 miles. Bearing northeast. Decided to approach. The journal describes a 6-hour hike through increasingly difficult terrain. Llewellyn noted that the tower remained visible throughout the approach. Unusual, he observed, because structures typically disappear behind intervening ridges and reappear as one gets closer. The tower doesn't behave like that, he wrote. It stays visible, like it wants to be seen. At approximately 2000 hours, Llewellyn reported reaching the base of the ridge where the tower stood. His final entry for that day is brief but disturbing. Reached the tower. It is larger than it appeared. Door on the north face. No handle, no hinges, just a seam in the stone. I pushed, and it opened inward. The dark inside is not empty. I am choosing not to enter. I do not know why I am certain, but I am. If I go inside, I will not come out. Llewellyn descended the ridge and hiked out the following day. He never returned to the area. His journal contains no further mention of the tower. Those who have seen the tower describe similar experiences, the sense that it is both present and unreachable, visible but somehow resistant to approach. A Forest Service ranger named Delphine Ouattara, who worked in the Gallatin district from 2001 to 2012, encountered the tower twice during her tenure. She discussed her experiences in a 2015 interview with a regional magazine focused on unexplained phenomena. The first time I was doing a routine patrol near Garnet Mountain, Ouattara said, I saw it clear as day, a stone tower on the ridge to the east. I radioed in to ask if there was a structure in that area. Dispatch said no, nothing on the maps. I hiked toward it for maybe 2 hours, and then the weather turned. I had to head back. The second sighting occurred 3 years later, under similar circumstances. Same tower, same ridge. I tried to get closer, but my radio started acting up, static, then nothing. I lost the signal completely. By the time I got it back, the tower was gone. Not hidden by clouds, gone. The ridge was empty. When asked if she believed the tower was real, Ouattara paused. I know what I saw, she said. I photographed it both times. The photos came out fine. But the location I marked on my map, I went back there later with a colleague, and there was nothing, just rocks and trees. No tower, no foundation, no sign that anything had ever been there. A commercial pilot named Howard Nketiah reported a sighting in 1971 while flying a supply run to a remote ranch near Big Sky. His account, recorded in a 2008 oral history project, describes circling the structure at an altitude of approximately 8,000 feet. It was definitely a tower, Nketiah said. Gray stone maybe 40 or 50 feet tall. I could see it casting a shadow. I flew over it twice to get a better look, and the second time, it wasn't there. Same ridge, same angle, same lighting, but the tower was gone. Nketiah's photographs, like those of other witnesses, show the tower clearly. Attempts to correlate the images with specific locations have failed. The Forest Service has no official position on the watchtower. Inquiries submitted through the Freedom of Information Act have produced no documentation of the structure, no construction records, no maintenance logs, no decommissioning reports. Aerial surveys of the Gallatin Range, conducted regularly since the 1950s, have never identified a stone tower matching the descriptions provided by witnesses. Satellite imagery, available since the 1970s, shows nothing unusual in the areas where the tower has been reported. A geologist named Dr. Amara Svensson, who specializes in alpine formations in the northern Rockies, examined several photographs of the tower in 2010 at the request of a journalist investigating the phenomenon. The stone appears to be granite, Svensson said, but the Gallatin Range is primarily composed of volcanic rock, andesite, basalt, tuff. Granite is present in limited quantities, but not in formations suitable for construction. If someone built that tower, they brought the material from somewhere else. When asked who might have built such a structure, Svensson had no answer. The location is too remote for casual construction. There's no road access, no evidence of historical habitation. The Crow and Shoshone peoples used the area seasonally, but there's no record of them building stone structures of that type. I don't know who built it. I don't know how. And frankly, based on the survey data, I'm not entirely convinced it exists in any stable location. The phrase stable location has been noted by several researchers. It implies something that other investigators have suggested but rarely stated directly, that the tower may not occupy a fixed position, that it may be visible from certain places at certain times, but unreachable by conventional navigation. This theory has no scientific support. It also has no scientific refutation. Victor Llewellyn, the hiker who claimed to have reached the tower in 1987, lived for another 16 years after his encounter. He never returned to the Gallatin Range. According to friends, he avoided discussing the experience, though he confirmed the events in his journal when asked. His camera, recovered after his death, contained no photographs from that trip. The roll of film had been exposed, developed, and stored with his other belongings. Every frame was blank. Not overexposed, not underexposed, simply empty, as if the camera had photographed nothing at all. The tower continues to be reported. Sightings occur roughly 3 or 4 times per year, always in summer, always on clear days. The photographs continue to accumulate. The coordinates continue to shift. No one has claimed to have entered the tower since Llewellyn. No one has attempted to explain the darkness he described, the darkness that, according to his journal, was not empty. The Gallatin Range remains open to hikers, climbers, and backcountry explorers. The trails are well maintained. The maps are accurate, as far as anyone knows, but somewhere on a ridge that may or may not exist in any fixed location, a stone tower stands, built by no one, recorded nowhere, waiting for someone to finally open the door and step inside. Some places exist only to be seen. Some doors open only once. And some questions are better left on the ridgeline, asked from a distance, never answered. The numbers never lied, but the numbers never made sense either. Butte, Montana sits at an elevation of 5,700 feet in the northern Rocky Mountains, built atop what was once called the richest hill on Earth. Copper deposits discovered in the 1870s transformed a small mining camp into one of the largest cities in the American West, its population swelling to nearly 100,000 by 1920. The wealth that flowed from the mines was staggering. And so was the human cost. Mining was dangerous work. Men died in tunnel collapses, explosions, and fires with grim regularity. The speculator mine disaster of 1917 alone killed 168 workers in a single night. Widows and orphans proliferated. The city's charitable institutions struggled to keep pace with the endless tide of children who needed care. St. Anne's Home for Orphaned Children was established in 1894 by the Sisters of Charity of Leavenworth, a Catholic order that operated hospitals and schools throughout the West. The orphanage occupied a 3-story brick building on the eastern edge of Butte, overlooking the mine headframes that dominated the skyline. It could house up to 75 children at capacity, though records suggest it rarely operated below that number. The sisters who ran St. Anne's were known for their meticulous record-keeping. Monthly ledgers documented every child by name, age, date of admission, and eventual disposition, whether adoption, transfer to another institution, or death. The records were maintained in a standardized format, bound in leather, and stored in the convent archive. It was in these records that a researcher named Gertrude Okonkwo discovered the anomaly in 1973 while compiling data for a demographic study of Montana's mining communities. The pattern was so consistent that Okonkwo initially assumed she was miscounting. She wasn't. The ledgers covering January 1901 through December 1917, a span of 204 months, showed a peculiar consistency. Each month's total count of children exceeded the previous month's total by exactly one, not on average, not approximately. Exactly one additional child every single month for 16 consecutive years. The mathematics were impossible. Okonkwo examined the underlying data. Children were admitted and discharged throughout each month. Some were adopted, some ran away, some died. Childhood diseases were common, and the mining city's air quality contributed to respiratory illnesses. The numbers fluctuated as they should have, but when the final tally was calculated at month's end, it always exceeded the previous month by one. In January of 1901, the ledger recorded 42 children. In February, 43. In March, 44. By December of 1917, the count had reached 246. In a facility designed to hold 75. The sisters had noted the discrepancy themselves. Marginal annotations appeared throughout the ledgers, written in different hands across the years. Most were simple question marks. A few contained brief comments, count verified twice, and cannot account for variance. One entry, dated March 1911, was more explicit. Sister Margaret Flaherty, who served as the home's administrator from 1908 to 1914, wrote in the margin, "The child who isn't ours was seen again in the East Dormitory. The other children refused to speak of it." No further explanation was provided. Sister Flaherty's subsequent entries contain no additional references to the observation. Gertrude Okonkwo's research files, now housed at Montana State University, contain interviews she conducted with elderly Butte residents in 1974 and 1975. Several had connections to St. Anne's, former residents, family members of staff, neighbors who remembered the building before its demolition. Agnes Moreau, who lived at St. Anne's from 1909 to 1912, was 81 years old when Okonkwo interviewed her. Her recollections were fragmented but specific. "We knew the count was wrong," Moreau said. "The sisters counted us every night before bed, lined us up in the hallway, but there was always one extra, not always the same one. It moved around. Sometimes a child in the back who shouldn't have been there, sometimes an extra hand when we held hands for prayer. We learned not to look directly at it. The ones who looked too long got sick." When asked to describe it, Moreau declined. "We didn't talk about it then," she said. "I'm not going to start now." A construction worker named Harold Buchanan, who participated in the demolition of the St. Anne's building in 1958, provided a different kind of testimony. Buchanan was interviewed not by Okonkwo, but by a Butte newspaper reporter in 1982 for an article about the city's vanished landmarks. "We found a room in the basement that wasn't on any of the blueprints," Buchanan said, "behind a brick wall that looked like it had been there since the building went up. Small room, maybe 10 by 12 feet. No windows, no other doors, just this spiral of shoes on the floor. The shoes were children's shoes, button-up boots, leather lace-ups, simple cloth slippers. 192 of them, arranged in a spiral pattern that began at the center of the room and wound outward toward the walls. They were all different sizes," Buchanan said, "different styles, like they'd been collected over years, maybe decades. We left them there and sealed the room back up. The foreman said it wasn't our business." The building was demolished 3 days later. The site is now a parking lot. the Sisters of Charity of Leavenworth maintain archives at their mother house in Kansas. Inquiries about St. Anne's home have been met with limited cooperation. A letter sent to Okonkwo in 1976 in response to her request for additional records stated that materials pertaining to the Butte orphanage were transferred to diocesan control following the closure of the facility and are no longer in our possession. The Diocese of Helena, which would have received such records, has no documentation of a transfer. A spokesman, contacted in 2008 by a genealogist researching Butte's orphanages, stated that the diocese possessed no records related to St. Anne's home and that any such materials may have been lost in the 1935 fire at the Chancery office. The 1935 fire is documented. Its extent, however, has been disputed. Insurance records suggest the damage was limited to a storage annex, not the main archive. Okonkwo attempted to reconcile the ledger counts with other sources: birth certificates, death records, adoption paperwork filed with the county. The results were inconclusive. The documented admissions, departures, and deaths at St. Anne's should have produced widely varying monthly totals. Instead, the count increased by 1 every month, without fail. A statistician consulted by Okonkwo in 1977 calculated the probability of such a pattern occurring by chance. The number was so small as to be effectively 0. Either the records were falsified, the statistician wrote in his assessment, or something was being counted that we don't have a category for. The ledgers themselves show no evidence of tampering. The handwriting varies appropriately across different administrators. The ink aging is consistent with the stated dates. The entries were made in real time by real people, recording what they believed to be true. They counted every night. They always found one more than they expected, and for 16 years, no one could explain where the extra child came from. St. Anne's home closed in 1921, 4 years after the counting anomaly ended. The final ledger entry, dated November of that year, shows a population of 37 children, a number consistent with the documented admissions and departures. The pattern had stopped as abruptly as it began. The December 1917 count was 246. The January 1918 count was 246. For the first time in 16 years, the numbers held steady. Sister Margaret Flaherty, who had noted "the child who isn't ours" in 1911, died in 1919 during the influenza pandemic. Her personal effects, donated to the Sisters of Charity archive, included a private journal that has never been made available to researchers. A single page from the journal, photographed by an archivist in 1963 and shared with Okonkwo, informally contains an undated entry. "I have stopped counting. The child knows when it is being counted. I believe that is what it wants. I have instructed the sisters to record the expected number, not the actual number. We will lie in the ledgers and tell the truth in our prayers. God forgive us. We did not know what we were feeding. The journal is no longer in the archive. No explanation for its removal has been provided. The 192 shoes found in the hidden basement room were never cataloged, never photographed, never examined. They were buried with the rubble when the building came down. 192 shoes, 204 months of counting, 246 children in a facility built for 75. The numbers never lied. But the numbers never added up either. And somewhere in Butte, beneath a parking lot that used to be an orphanage, 192 pairs of small shoes lie in a spiral, pointing toward a center that no one ever reached, and a child that no one ever claimed. Four men went into the Pryor Mountains for 14 days. They came out with 15. The Pryor Mountains rise from the high plains of south-central Montana, a compact range that straddles the Montana-Wyoming border approximately 60 miles south of Billings. The terrain is rugged and isolated, a maze of limestone canyons, alpine meadows, and ancient juniper forests that has resisted human settlement more successfully than most landscapes in the northern Rockies. The Crow Nation considers portions of the range sacred, and certain areas remain off-limits to outsiders by tribal agreement. The range is also geologically unusual. Caves honeycomb the limestone formations, some extending hundreds of feet below the surface. Ice caves maintain sub-freezing temperatures year-round. The rock itself is ancient, Paleozoic sedimentary layers that predate the dinosaurs, tilted and fractured by forces that shaped the region millions of years ago. In 1964, the United States Geological Survey dispatched a four-man team to conduct a comprehensive mapping project in the northern section of the range. The goal was to update topographical charts that had not been revised since 1922, incorporating new data on elevation, drainage patterns, and geological features. The assignment was routine, 2 weeks of fieldwork in remote terrain, followed by office analysis and map production. The team leader was Raymond Kowalski, a senior surveyor with 18 years of USGS experience. His crew consisted of Malcolm Ihejirika, a cartographer specializing in alpine terrain, Paul Lindquist, a geologist assigned to document rock formations, and Thomas Nyambura, a technician responsible for equipment and field measurements. They entered the Pryor Mountains on June 15, 1964. They exited on June 29th, exactly on schedule. The problem wasn't discovered until 3 weeks later, when the field logs were submitted for archival processing. USGS field protocols in 1964 required daily log entries documenting location, weather conditions, work completed, and observations. Each crew member maintained an individual log, and the team leader compiled a summary at the end of each day. The logs were numbered sequentially, with dates recorded at the top of each page. When the Pryor Mountains logs reached the Denver Processing Center in mid-July, a clerk named Dorothy Halloran noticed a discrepancy. Raymond Kowalski's summary log contained 15 daily entries, numbered 1 through 15, spanning June 15th through June 29th. The dates matched the assignment period, 14 days, but there were 15 entries. Halloran initially assumed a clerical error. She cross-referenced the individual crew logs. Each of the four men had recorded 15 days of work. The entries were sequential, coherent, and consistent across all four logs. There was no obvious duplication, no repeated date, no blank page that might have been accidentally numbered. 15 distinct days of survey work had been documented during a 14-day period. Halloran flagged the logs for supervisor review. Her handwritten note, preserved in the archived file, reads, "Day counts do not reconcile. Unable to identify error source. Recommend crew interview." The four surveyors were interviewed separately in August of 1964. Each confirmed that the assignment had lasted 14 days. Each confirmed that they had worked every day with no rest days or weather delays. Each confirmed that they had submitted accurate logs reflecting their work. None could identify which of the 15 entries did not belong. "I've been doing this for almost 20 years, Kowalski said, according to the interview transcript. "I know how to count days. We left on the 15th. We came back on the 29th. That's 14 days. I don't know why the log says 15, but I wrote those entries. They're all in my handwriting. I can't tell you which one is wrong." The individual crew logs reveal subtle discrepancies that the summary log obscures. Malcolm Ihejirika's cartographic notes for Day 8 contain coordinates that do not correspond to any known location in the Pryor Mountains. The latitude and longitude, when plotted, indicate a point approximately 4 miles east of the range's mapped boundary, a location that, according to USGS charts, consists of open rangeland with no significant topographical features. But Ihejirika's notes describe complex terrain, a narrow canyon with vertical walls, a seasonal streambed filled with white stones, and what he called unusual acoustic properties. Voices echo incorrectly, delayed by 2 to 3 seconds, regardless of distance. Paul Lindquist's geological notes for the same day describe rock formations inconsistent with the prior mountain's known geology. Dark basalt intrusion, approximately 40 feet wide, bisecting limestone formation, origin unclear, no similar feature observed elsewhere in survey area. Thomas Nyambura's equipment log for Day 8 contains a single anomaly. His compass readings show magnetic north shifting by 17 degrees over a 4-hour period, then returning to normal. Raymond Kowalski's summary for Day 8 is brief. Survey of eastern section complete. All measurements recorded. Crew in good health. No incidents. When interviewed, none of the 4 men could recall Day 8 specifically. They remembered Days 7 and 9 clearly. Day 8 was simply absent from their memories, despite being thoroughly documented in their own handwriting. A USGS psychologist who reviewed the interviews noted, all 4 subjects display consistent memory gaps regarding a specific portion of their assignment. No evidence of trauma, substance use, or deliberate deception. Pattern is highly unusual but not clinically explicable. The coordinates logged by Malcolm Ihejirika for Day 8 were investigated by a follow-up team in September of 1964. The location was accessible by vehicle, open grassland near the eastern boundary of the Crow Reservation. The follow-up team found nothing, no canyon, no stream bed, no basalt intrusion. The terrain was flat and featureless, consistent with existing maps. A USGS supervisor named Harold Bjornson wrote in his assessment, "The coordinates provided do not correspond to any observable terrain feature. Either the original notation was in error, or the feature has been incorrectly located. Recommend correction in final documentation." The correction was never made. The original logs were archived with the anomalous coordinates intact. Modern mapping technology has since confirmed that the location described in Ihejirika's notes does not exist, at least not where he recorded it. Satellite imagery shows undifferentiated grassland. Topographical surveys detect no elevation changes consistent with a canyon. The USGS database contains no record of a basalt intrusion in that section of Montana. The Crow Nation, whose reservation borders the disputed coordinates, has been asked about the location on several occasions. Responses have been limited. A tribal historian named Bernard 4 Bears, contacted by a journalist in 2002, offered a brief comment. "There are places that the maps don't show," 4 Bears said. "Places that show themselves when they want to and hide when they don't. Our elders know about them. We don't survey them. We don't try to find them. Some places aren't meant to be measured." When asked if he believed the USGS team had encountered such a place, 4 Bears did not respond directly. 4 men, he said, 4 different states, all dead within 2 years. That's not my business to explain, but I wouldn't go looking for what they found. Raymond Kowalski died in March of 1966 in a single-vehicle accident in rural Oregon. He was 54 years old. Malcolm Ihejirika died in August of 1966 of heart failure in his home in Illinois. He was 38 years old with no prior history of cardiac problems. Paul Lindquist died in November of 1966 in a fall from a cliff in New Mexico during a personal hiking trip. He was 41 years old. Thomas Nyambura died in January of 1967 of an undiagnosed neurological condition in a hospital in Texas. He was 33 years old. 4 men, 4 states, 18 months. The statistical probability of 4 healthy men dying within such a compressed time frame from unrelated causes in disparate locations is low but not impossible. No formal investigation was conducted. The deaths were recorded as unconnected. The field logs from the prior mountain survey remain in the USGS archive in Denver. They have been digitized and are available to researchers. The 15th day is still there, documented, detailed, and impossible to account for. No one has been able to explain where it came from. The prior mountains remain largely unmapped in their deepest sections. Budget constraints and limited scientific interest have prevented comprehensive surveys. The original 1964 project was never completed. The data was deemed too inconsistent for reliable map production. The coordinates from Day 8 have been checked periodically, most recently in 2018 by a graduate student researching cartographic anomalies. Each check has produced the same result. Nothing there. Flat ground, empty grass, silence. But the logs remain. 4 men, writing independently, recorded the same impossible day. They describe terrain that doesn't exist, phenomena that can't be explained, and a location that refuses to appear on any map. 15 days of work, 14 days on the calendar. One day that came from somewhere else and took 4 men with it when it left. The prior mountains keep their secrets. They have been keeping them for a very long time. And somewhere in the archives, in handwriting that grows more faded each year, 4 surveyors describe a place they visited, a day they lived, and a truth they could never remember. Day 8 is still waiting to be found, or perhaps it's waiting for someone else to find it. There is a room in northeastern Montana where sound goes to disappear. Fort Peck Dam spans the Missouri River in the remote northeastern corner of the state, approximately 18 miles southeast of Glasgow. When it was completed in 1940, it was the largest hydraulic earth-filled dam in the world, a massive public works project that employed over 50,000 workers during the Great Depression and transformed a stretch of empty prairie into the centerpiece of New Deal ambition. The reservoir it created, Fort Peck Lake, stretches over 130 miles and contains more shoreline than the California coast. The dam itself is an engineering monument, but its history is also marked by tragedy. During construction, on September 22, 1938, a section of the dam's face collapsed, sending millions of tons of earth and water into the spillway. 8 workers were killed instantly. Their bodies were never recovered, entombed somewhere in the structure they had helped build. The Fort Peck Interpretive Center was established in 1990 to commemorate the dam's construction and educate visitors about its history and function. The center occupies a modern building near the dam's powerhouse, featuring exhibits on engineering, wildlife, and the human stories of those who built and maintained the massive structure. One room in the center has developed a reputation that no exhibit plaque acknowledges. It is a small space, perhaps 12 feet by 15, dedicated to communications technology from the dam's construction era. Glass cases display vacuum tube radios, telegraph equipment, and early telephone apparatus, the tools workers used to coordinate across the vast construction site. None of the equipment is functional. None has been connected to power in decades. But visitors who enter the room describe an experience that no curator has been able to explain. The first documented report came in the spring of 1994, 4 years after the Interpretive Center opened. A visitor named Stanley Ebersole, a retired electrician from Billings, mentioned the anomaly in a comment card submitted to the front desk. "Something wrong with the acoustics in the radio room," Ebersole wrote. Complete silence when you walk in, not just quiet. Silent, like my ears stopped working. Thought I was having a medical episode until I walked out and could hear again. The comment was filed without follow-up. Similar observations accumulated over the following years, noted by staff, but never formally investigated. Visitors used remarkably consistent language to describe their experiences. Dead air, pressure in my ears, like being underwater but dry. In 2003, a regional journalist named Lucinda Parham visited the center while researching a feature on Montana's Depression-era landmarks. Her article, published in a Great Falls newspaper, included a brief mention of the radio room. The most unsettling exhibit isn't the photographs of the collapse or the memorial to the 8 lost workers, Parham wrote. It's a small room filled with antique radio equipment that produces a silence so complete it feels aggressive. My recorder captured nothing inside, not even my own breathing, which I could feel but not hear. Staff declined to comment on the phenomenon. The article generated modest local interest. A handful of visitors made trips specifically to experience the room. Most reported the same phenomenon: total, instantaneous silence upon crossing the threshold, followed by normal hearing upon exit. A few reported something else. Tsaba. Marcus Delgado, a construction worker from Miles City, visited the Interpretive Center in August of 2007 with his 2 young sons. In an interview conducted 3 years later for a podcast investigating unusual sights in Montana, Delgado described his experience in the radio room. "The quiet hit me the second I walked in," Delgado said. "My boys were talking. I could see their mouths moving, but I couldn't hear them. I couldn't hear my own footsteps. I couldn't hear my heartbeat. And I can always hear my heartbeat in quiet places. It was like the room had swallowed sound." Delgado spent approximately 5 minutes in the exhibit before the silence became unbearable. As he stepped back through the doorway, sound returned instantly. But just before it came back, in that split second between the silence and the normal noise of the museum, I heard a voice, clear as day. It said, "Here." Just that one word. And here's the thing. It was my voice. Not someone else's, mine, but I didn't say it. I know I didn't say it. My mouth was closed. Delgado's sons, aged 9 and 11 at the time, did not report hearing the voice. They confirmed the silence but described nothing unusual upon exit. A retired schoolteacher named Harriet Johansson experienced the room in 2012. Her account, shared with a Historical Society volunteer, aligns with Delgado's in key details. "I've been in anechoic chambers, rooms designed to absorb all sound," Johansson said. "This was different. Those rooms feel artificial, engineered. The radio room felt hungry, like it was actively taking sound rather than simply not producing it. And when I left, I heard something, a single word in a voice I recognized. My voice saying, 'Here.' But I was certain I hadn't spoken." When asked what she believed the word meant, Johansson shook her head. "I don't know, but for weeks afterward, I kept catching myself listening for it, like I was waiting to hear it again, like something was waiting for me to answer." The Fort Peck Interpretive Center has never officially acknowledged the acoustic anomaly. Staff members, when asked, typically attribute visitor reports to the room's unusual shape or the sound-absorbing properties of the display cases. An acoustic engineer named Dr. Yusuf Nakamura visited the center in 2015 at the request of a journalist researching the phenomenon. Nakamura brought professional equipment capable of measuring ambient noise levels, sound absorption, and acoustic reflection patterns. His findings were inconclusive. "The room's acoustics are unusual but not unprecedented," Nakamura wrote in his assessment. "The combination of materials, glass, fabric, concrete, creates a moderately absorptive environment. What I cannot explain is the subjective experience reported by visitors. My instruments recorded normal ambient sound throughout the visit. Traffic noise from outside, HVAC systems, my own breathing, all registered at expected levels. But I perceived silence, complete, oppressive silence. The instruments and my ears disagreed. Nakamura's written report contains a handwritten addendum not included in the version shared with the journalist. Upon exiting the room, I heard a word that I did not speak. It was my voice. It said, "Here." I am not comfortable speculating on the implications. The radio equipment displayed in the room has been examined multiple times. None of it is connected to any power source. Several pieces are incomplete, lacking essential components that would be necessary for operation. A 1934 Philco Cathedral radio is missing its power transformer. A Western electric telephone switchboard has no internal wiring. The equipment is, by any technical measure, incapable of producing sound. And yet, Army Corps of Engineers records from the dam's construction era mention communication difficulties in the area during the 1930s. Radio signals were reportedly unreliable near the dam site, subject to interference that engineers attributed to the region's unusual geology. A memo from October 1938, 1 month after the fatal collapse, notes that radio contact was lost with construction crews in Section 4 for approximately 6 hours on the afternoon of the 22nd. The cause of the blackout was not determined. Section 4 was where the collapse occurred. The 8 workers whose bodies were never recovered had been assigned to that section. The radio room remains open to visitors. The interpretive center operates seasonally, welcoming tourists who come to fish Fort Peck Lake or learn about the dam's history. Most visitors pass through the radio exhibit without incident, admiring the vintage equipment and reading the informational placards. Some visitors stay longer than they intend to. Staff have noted that certain people seem drawn to the room, lingering at the threshold, reluctant to enter, but equally reluctant to leave. A few have been found standing motionless inside, staring at equipment that hasn't functioned in 80 years, apparently unable to hear the staff members calling to them. They always emerge eventually. Sound always returns. But those who have heard the voice, the single word in their own voice that they know they did not speak, describe a persistent unease that doesn't fade, a sense of having answered a question they don't remember being asked, a feeling that something, somewhere, noted their presence and is waiting for them to return. The word is always the same, "Here," as if confirming attendance, as if responding to a roll call that no one can hear. 8 workers died in the collapse of 1938. Their bodies were never found. Their voices were never recorded. But something in that room is still listening, still waiting for someone to answer, still marking, in silence and in sound, who has arrived. Here, here, here. He brought 400 frames to the mountains. The mountains sent them all back empty. Glacier National Park occupies over 1 million acres of the northern Rocky Mountains, pressed against the Canadian border in a landscape that has remained largely unchanged since the last ice age. The park is named for the glaciers that carved its valleys and peaks, ancient rivers of ice that have been retreating steadily for over a century. By some estimates, the glaciers that gave the park its name will be entirely gone within a generation. The terrain is among the most rugged in North America. Jagged peaks rise over 10,000 feet. Lakes of impossible blue fill basins gouged from bedrock. Wildlife roams freely: grizzly bears, mountain goats, wolves, and elk, in densities found nowhere else in the lower 48 states. The park's isolation is profound. Some valleys see fewer than 100 human visitors per year. The Blackfeet Nation, whose reservation borders the park's eastern boundary, has lived in the shadow of these mountains for centuries. They call the region the backbone of the world and hold certain areas sacred, places where tribal members do not go or go only for specific ceremonies conducted in specific ways. The boundaries of these sacred sites do not appear on park maps. They are not discussed with outsiders. In 1971, National Geographic commissioned a feature on Glacier's backcountry to be photographed by one of their most accomplished wilderness photographers. The assignment was prestigious, the access extraordinary. The photographer spent 3 weeks in the park, covering over 200 miles on foot, documenting landscapes that few outsiders had ever seen. He returned with nothing. The photographer's name was Ellis Vandermeer. He was 43 years old in 1971, with a career spanning 2 decades and 5 continents. His work had appeared in National Geographic, Life, and Audubon. He was known for his technical precision and his willingness to endure extreme conditions for the perfect shot. Vandermeer entered Glacier on June 8, 1971, accompanied by a park ranger assigned to guide him through the backcountry. The ranger, a seasonal employee named James Birdwell, would accompany him for the first week before returning to his regular duties. Vandermeer would spend the remaining 2 weeks alone. According to Birdwell's subsequent report, the first week proceeded without incident. Weather was favorable. Vandermeer shot extensively: mountain vistas, wildlife, wildflower meadows, glacial formations. He was methodical and focused, exposing between 40 and 60 frames per day. On June 15th, Birdwell hiked out, and Vandermeer continued alone into the park's most remote sections. He was scheduled to emerge at the Goat Haunt Ranger Station on June 29th. He arrived on schedule, appearing tired but uninjured. He spoke little to the rangers who met him, mentioning only that the trip had been difficult in ways I didn't expect. He declined a debriefing and departed for his home in Vermont the following day. 3 weeks later, Vandermeer contacted the National Geographic photo department with news that would end the assignment permanently. Every frame he had exposed in Glacier National Park had come back blank. Not overexposed. Not underexposed, blank, pure, even white across 412 frames, as if the film had never been used at all. The photo editor who received Vandermeer's call was a woman named Constance Oduya, who had worked with him on multiple previous assignments. In a 2009 interview for a photography history project, Oduya described her reaction. "I assumed it was a processing error," Oduya said. "These things happen. Labs make mistakes." But Ellis had used 3 different film stocks from 3 different manufacturers, and he'd processed them at 2 different labs. All blank, every single frame. Oduya requested that Vandermeer's equipment be tested. The cameras, 2 Nikon F2 bodies, and a medium-format Hasselblad were examined by a technician and found to be functioning normally. Test rolls shot before and after the Glacier assignment developed perfectly. "There was nothing wrong with the cameras," Oduya said. "Nothing wrong with the film. Nothing wrong with the processing. The equipment worked fine everywhere except inside that park." Vandermeer himself was reluctant to discuss the assignment. Colleagues who spoke with him in the months following his return described him as withdrawn and evasive. A fellow photographer named Martin Okonkwo, who had known Vandermeer since the early 1960s, visited him in Vermont in September of 1971. "He showed me the contact sheets," Okonkwo said in a 2012 interview. "Rows and rows of white rectangles. I asked him what he thought had happened, and he just shook his head. He said, 'The photographs show what's there, but there's something the camera won't see.' I didn't know what that meant. I'm not sure he did either." James Birdwell, the ranger who accompanied Vandermeer during the first week, was contacted by National Geographic as part of their internal review. His statement, preserved in the magazine's archives, contains a curious observation. "Ellis shot constantly while I was with him," Birdwell wrote, Hundreds of frames easy, but I noticed something odd on the last day before I hiked out. He took a photograph of Grinnell Glacier. Beautiful shot, perfect conditions, and then he looked at the camera like something was wrong. I asked him what was the matter. He said it didn't feel like anything happened. I didn't understand what he meant at the time. I think I do now. National Geographic conducted an internal review of the failed assignment but never published its findings. The feature on Glacier was quietly canceled and never rescheduled. Vandermeer's journal from the assignment was donated to the International Center of Photography in New York following his death in 2003. Most entries are technical: exposure settings, weather conditions, locations visited. The journal's tone shifts noticeably after Birdwell's departure on June 15th, June 16th. Alone now. The silence here is different than other wilderness. Heavier, like the air itself is paying attention. June 19th. Shot 63 frames at Iceberg Lake. Something wrong with how the light behaves here. Shadows don't match the sun position. Checked my compass. Magnetic variance normal, but the light is wrong. June 23rd. Beginning to understand that the photographs will not work. The camera sees, but the film will not record. I continue shooting because I don't know what else to do. June 26th. It knows I'm here, the park, the mountains, whatever it is that watches from the glaciers. It has known since I arrived. The photographs are not failing because of equipment. They are failing because something does not wish to be seen. I should be afraid. I am not afraid. That frightens me more. The final entry, dated June 28th, the day before Vandermeer's emergence at Goat Haunt, contains only 2 sentences. It let me leave. I don't know why. Park Service records from 1971 contain no unusual incident reports for the dates of Vandermeer's assignment. No other visitors reported equipment failures or strange phenomena. The areas Vandermeer visited have been photographed thousands of times since, with no documented anomalies. A photography professor named Dr. Keiko Sorensen, who has studied the case extensively, examined Vandermeer's blank negatives in 2016. Her analysis found no evidence of tampering, chemical damage, or exposure malfunction. The film shows no image whatsoever, Sorensen wrote, not even the edge markings that would normally be present. It's as if the film was never exposed at all, except we know it was loaded in functional cameras, advanced through the mechanism, and processed normally. The film should contain images. It contains nothing. Ellis Vandermeer never returned to Glacier National Park. He continued working as a photographer for another decade, specializing in urban and architectural subjects. He never accepted another wilderness assignment. Friends who knew him in his later years described a man who had lost something essential, not his technical skill, which remained sharp, but his passion for the natural world. He sold his camping equipment in 1973. He declined invitations to photograph national parks, mountain ranges, or remote landscapes. A former assistant named Bridget Okello recalled a conversation from 1985. I asked him once why he stopped shooting wilderness, Okello said. He told me, "Some places don't want to be remembered. They tolerate visitors, but they don't allow evidence." I spent 3 weeks in a place like that. It showed me everything, and it kept everything. I still see it when I close my eyes. I just can't prove it exists. Vandermeer's camera equipment was auctioned after his death. The Nikon F2 bodies sold to collectors who reported no issues. The Hasselblad was purchased by a nature photographer who used it extensively in the Pacific Northwest. The blank negatives remain at the International Center of Photography, stored in acid-free sleeves, cataloged but unexplained. 412 frames of nothing. A 3-week journey through one of the most beautiful landscapes in North America, recorded in perfect absence. The glaciers continue to retreat. The mountains continue to watch. And somewhere in Glacier National Park, whatever refused to be photographed in 1971 is still there, still waiting, still patient, still choosing who leaves and who stays, what is remembered and what remains forever invisible. It let him leave. 50 years later, no one knows why.